Dear ladies and gentlemen, if we could find our seat, that would be nice. Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this seminar. My name is Trond Enger, and I'm the chairperson of the board of STL. And I'm so lucky that I can wish you all welcome. 2022 was supposed to be the year where things got back on track after the two first and hardest years of the COVID pandemic. The restrictions were lifted, and we were free to gather in movie theaters, concert halls, and of course, temple, mosques, and churches. But it wasn't the year we got back on track. On the 24th of February, the greatest land war in Europe since the Second World War erupted with the invasion of Ukraine. How could this be? How could this happen in our time and age? Religion certainly plays a role in this conflict. Today, Professor Vebjørn Horsfjord will give us some insight into how. And Professor Torkel Brekke was supposed to share his insights on how religions contribute to warfare in particular ways, but he is unfortunately ill and cannot attend the conference. Our American guest, Professor William Cavanaugh, on the other hand, will share with us his perspective that religion cannot easily be separated from other forces that contribute to war. There seems to be a tendency to single out religion as a particularly toxic ingredient in the stew of belligerence and violence. That is a mistake, according to Cavanaugh. And I would like to invite him up to share with us his lecture on Does Religion Promote Violence? Welcome.
Thanks, John, and Ingrid, and Hans and Kai, and everybody that has facilitated my visit here. I just got in to my hotel about 11:30 last night, so I'm still kind of waking up. So if I nod off, somebody please nudge me. But it's really nice to be here, and I'm really so appreciative of this organization, because it seems to be doing a lot of what I've been advocating for, is to bring so-called religious and so-called secular peoples together on an equal footing to kind of level the playing field. And that's basically what I'm arguing for in this book on which this lecture is based. So, as Trond mentioned, there's a common thread that runs through discussions today about immigration from the Middle East, about proposals to ban religious schools in Sweden, about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the common idea is that religion has a peculiar tendency to be irrational and divisive and therefore violent. And the solution is thought to be secularization, that is, the marginalization of religion from public influence, as in the banning of religion from schools, and excluding people from the country who take the will of God too seriously. When I gave a lecture with the title, Does Religion Cause Violence, at a university a little while ago, I passed a poster for the lecture on the way to the lecture hall, and somebody had scrawled the word duh over the poster as if to say, of course it does, because everybody knows that religion causes violence, and we can cite many different examples In Norway, the June 2022 shooting at the London pub in Oslo is one of the latest examples. Some people try to deny this and say that the violence is really economic or political or social and not religious, but I don't think those arguments work. Such arguments can easily be refuted by the terrorists' own words. They also assume a clear distinction between the religious and the political and the economic and so on. That is impossible to pull off, as I will argue. Nor does it work to claim that, well, you know, the Crusaders weren't really Christians or the ISIS is not really Muslims. Normatively, I think it's important for Christians and Muslims to claim that the Crusaders and the terrorists have got the message of Christianity and Islam wrong. But descriptively, I think it's disingenuous for Christians and Muslims to absolve their own group from wrongdoing by disowning their own bad co-religionists. So people can and do commit violence in the name of their faith. Let's be clear about that. But the common notion is the stronger claim that religion has a greater propensity to promote violence than what is not religion. And what is not religion is called the secular. So the idea that religion promotes violence depends entirely on the distinction between the religious and the secular, as in this table. So in the religious column are generally included Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, etc. Under secular, we find non-religious categories of human life, such as politics and economics, as well as ideologies and practices like nationalism and atheism and Marxism and capitalism and so on. The common notion that religion is peculiarly prone to violence depends on the idea that these secular matters have less of a tendency to promote violence because they have to do with purely mundane affairs. Religion, on the other hand, is commonly assumed to be peculiarly absolutist and divisive and irrational and therefore violent. But if we cast a glance over the extraordinarily bloody last 100 years or so, complicating evidence presses itself upon us. World War I, for example, to which nationalism is usually assigned as the primary cause, resulted in 38 million military and civilian casualties. Or if we ask, who has killed more people in the last 100 years, Muslims or atheists? The answer is atheists, and it's not even close. Deaths under atheist Marxist regimes are estimated in figures that range as high as 110 million. So the last 100 years have seen frequent war waged for oil, land, flags, free markets, democracy, ethnicity, and a host of other secular causes. So what becomes of the idea that religion has a peculiar tendency to promote violence in the face of this evidence? Well, for some religion and violence theorists, the answer to this problem is simple. You just move the offending ideologies over to the other side of the table. So atheist Christopher Hitchens, for example, takes this approach in his best-selling book, God is Not Great, which is subtitled with typical British understatement, How Religion Poisons Everything. And he argues totalitarianism aims at human perfection, which is essentially a religious impulse. So religion poisons everything because everything poisonous gets identified as religion. And at the same time, everything good ends up on the other side of the religious-secular divide. And so Hitchens says of Martin Luther King Jr., in no real as opposed to nominal sense was he a Christian, and he bases this remarkable conclusion on the notion that King was nonviolent, and so what's not violent cannot possibly be religious because religion is defined as violent. Now, Hitchens is not alone. Once we start examining arguments that religion causes violence, we find that this sort of smoke and mirrors is the norm. Consider the case of preeminent historian Martin Marty. In a book on public religion, Marty argues that religion has a peculiar tendency to be divisive and therefore violent, but Marty lists 17 different definitions of religion, and then he says, I'm not going to give you a definition since scholars will never agree on a definition of religion. And instead, he gives a list of 5 features that marks a religion, and then he proceeds to show how politics fits all 5 of the same features. So religion focuses our ultimate concern, so does politics. Religion builds community, so does politics, and so on down the list. He's trying to show how intertwined religion and politics are, but he demolishes any theoretical basis for separating the two. So what becomes of the religious-secular distinction here is not clear. Another example, sociologist Mark Juergensmeyer, whose book Terror in the Mind of God is one of the most widely read academic books on religion and violence. According to Juergensmeyer, religion exacerbates the tendency to divide people into friends and enemies, good and evil, us and them, by ratcheting divisions up to a cosmic level. But he's forced to admit the difficulty of separating religious violence from secular violence. So he writes, secular nationalism, like religion, embraces what one scholar calls a doctrine of destiny. One can take this way of looking at secular nationalism a step further and state flatly that secular nationalism is a religion. Now that's an important concession, as is his claim that the secular is a sort of advanced form of religion, but if it's true, it subverts the entire basis of his argument. So what becomes of the religious-secular divide if the secular is a form of religion? So some religion and violence theorists deal with the problem here by openly and consistently expanding the category of religion. Richard Wentz's book, Why People Do Bad Things in the Name of Religion, includes not only Islam and Christianity and so on, but also consumerism, secular humanism, football fanaticism, faith in technology, and a host of other ideologies and practices under the rubric religion. And so he concludes, unsurprisingly, perhaps all of us do bad things in the name of religion. He has intuited correctly, I think, that people do violence for all sorts of reasons, but where he goes wrong is in thinking that he can obliterate the line between religious and secular and still end up blaming violence on religion. So instead of an argument for why religion has a greater tendency than the secular to promote violence, Wentz has simply taken everything for which people do violence and labeled it religion. Now, Wentz is what's called a functionalist, that is, a scholar who believes that religion is whatever functions like one. There's a vast literature on Marxism as a religion, for example. You can compare these 2 images and see why. Whoops. There's an extensive body of scholarship on nationalism as a religion. Carolyn Marvin argues that, quote, nationalism is the most powerful religion in the United States and perhaps in many other countries, end quote. Robert Bella explores the prevalence of civil religion in the United States, which, as he says, quote, has its own seriousness and integrity and requires the same care and understanding that any other religion does. And so there's all kinds of literature on the peculiar myths and symbols and sacrifices that surround the flag. This is the way American school children used to salute the American flag and say the Pledge of Allegiance until Hitler made this gesture unpopular in the 1930s, and now it's hand over heart. This is actually the image that I asked Oxford University Press to put on the cover of the book, but they thought it was a little bit too shocking, so they didn't. Lots of examples. This again is, Detroit. It's not Nuremberg. All kinds of examples in the U.S. This is what you see if you look up into the dome of the Capitol building in Washington. It's called the apotheosis of Washington, the becoming God of Washington, where George Washington is ascending into the heavens, surrounded by various mythological figures. The same phenomenon is found in economics. A business school dean was quoted in the New York Times expressing his belief that free markets always work better than state control, and he said, "I believe in that premise as a matter of religious faith." And so scholars who take a functionalist approach take him at his word, right? If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's a duck, right? So a survey of religious studies literature finds the following treated under the rubric religion: totems, witchcraft, human rights, Marxism, liberalism, Freudianism, Japanese tea ceremonies, nationalism, sports, free market ideology, Alcoholics Anonymous, and a host of other institutions and practices. So at this point, though, you might be thinking, well, all of those people are just wrong. We know what religion is. It's belief in God or gods, right? So just go back to that first slide, and it's clear enough. But some things on this list that are usually called religions, such as Taoism and Confucianism and many forms of Buddhism, don't have a central concept of God or gods. So you might say, okay, well, let's expand the definition of religion to include such belief systems under the rubric of transcendence, or some more inclusive term. But if we do that, then all sorts of other practices, including many that are usually labeled secular, fall under the definition of religion. So many institutions and ideologies that don't explicitly refer to God, for example, function in the same way as those that do. Expanding the concept of religion to include godless Buddhism makes it difficult to exclude godless Marxism. And likewise, it's hard to imagine a better candidate for transcendence than nationalism. So the point here is that at least implicitly, the point here is at least implicitly acknowledged by the name of the organization that's sponsoring this conference, the Council for Religious and Life Stance Communities in Norway. The broad term life stance recognizes the seriousness and foundational nature of some worldviews and practices, whether they claim belief in God or gods or not. Although the name leaves open the question of whether there is a difference between religions and life stances, the Council doesn't try to quarantine something called religion from the secular kinds of life stances. And I think that's really positive. So even if we could find a way to stabilize these categories of religious and secular and get everybody to agree what belongs in each category once and for all, would it be any help with the question of violence? Is there any good reason to suppose that people are more likely to kill for a god than kill for a nation? So in my context in the United States, if you ask what percentage of Christians will be willing to kill for their Christian faith, the answer is very low, despite what a lot of people, the stereotype that a lot of Europeans have of Americans. But if you ask what percentage will be willing to kill for their country, the percentage would be very high, right? So despite some increasingly loud Christian nationalism, for the majority of American Christians, even public evangelization is considered to be in poor taste, and yet most endorse organized slaughter on behalf of the nation as sometimes necessary and often laudable. So I think we have to conclude that there's no coherent way to isolate religious ideologies with a peculiar tendency toward violence from their tamer secular counterparts. So-called secular ideologies and institutions like nationalism and capitalism can inspire just as much violence as so-called religion. And if all of this sounds just like academic hair-splitting over definitions, it's nothing more complicated than what the Bible says about idolatry. This is the theological implication of everything I've been saying. People treat all kinds of things as gods, golden calves and armies and mammon and even their own bellies, as Paul tells the Philippians. So-called religious and so-called secular ideas and practices often function in the same way. So the myth of religious violence fails because it depends entirely on a stable religious-secular divide that doesn't exist. There is no once and for all definition of religion. Religion is a category which is constructed in different ways in different times and places, and according to the interests of who's doing the construction. And to understand why there's so much confusion around the category of religion, I want to briefly examine its history. So, second part. Charles Kimball's book, When Religion Becomes Evil, begins with the following claim: "It is somewhat trite, but nevertheless sadly true, to say that more wars have been waged, more people killed, and these days more evil perpetrated in the name of religion than by any other institutional force in human history." Now, if one were try to prove this claim, one would need a transhistorical and transcultural concept of religion, all times and all places, that is, that would at least be theoretically separable from other institutional forces over the course of history. So political institutions, for example. But the problem is that there was no religion as considered something separable from politics until the modern era, and then primarily in the West. So the Romans had the term religio, but there was no religion-politics distinction. How could there be when Caesar is a god? Likewise, if you ask the question, is Aztec politics to blame for their bloody human sacrifices, or is it Aztec religion? Well, the question just doesn't make any sense in the Aztec context. As Wilfred Cantwell Smith showed in his landmark 1962 book, The Meaning and End of Religion, religion as a discrete category of human activity separable from culture and politics and other areas of human life is an invention of the modern West. The ancient Romans employed the term religio, but it covered all kinds of civic duties and relations of respect that we would consider secular. So St. Augustine says in The City of God, we have no right to affirm with confidence that religio is confined to the worship of God, since it seems that this word has been detached from its normal meaning, in which it refers to an attitude of respect in relations between a man and his neighbor. Augustine is writing this in the 5th century. In the medieval era, the religious-secular distinction was the distinction between clergy who belonged to an order and diocesan clergy, two different kinds of priests. There was no realm of secular pursuits to which God was indifferent, and although there was a distinction between civil and ecclesiastical authorities, there was no distinction between politics and religion as we conceive it. So where did it come from? This religious-secular distinction as we know it today was a creation of the early modern struggles for power between ecclesiastical and civil authorities in the creation of the modern sovereign state between the 5th, 15th, and the 17th centuries. Religion was invented as a universal, essentially interior and private impulse that is essentially separate from politics and other secular concerns. So henceforth, the church's proper area of concern would be essentially alien from politics. It's a way of marginalizing the church. And although it was a contingent European arrangement, the religious-secular distinction was made to seem natural as it was exported to the non-Western cultures during the process of colonization. So Smith's study concludes that, quote, there is no closely equivalent concept to religion in any culture that has not been influenced by the modern West. There was no such concept in ancient Greece, Egypt, China, India, or anywhere else in the ancient world. In their initial encounters with the non-Western world, European explorers reported with remarkable consistency that the natives have no religion at all. But once they were colonized, the category religion became a powerful tool for the classification of native cultures as essentially distinct from the business of government. So Hinduism, for example, a term first used in the 1780s. You have Hindus before that, but not Hinduism. It became a religion in the course of the 19th century, despite the fact that it encompasses the entire Indian way of life, everything we would include under culture and politics and religion and economy. Fritz Stahl has concluded, quote, Hinduism does not merely fail to be a religion, it is not even a meaningful unit of discourse. And he doesn't mean that as an insult to Hindus, he means that it encompasses so much more than what we call religion. But the classification proved really useful under British rule. If Hinduism was a religion, then to be Indian was to be private, and to be British was to be public. And that's why many contemporary advocates of Hindu nationalism, especially the ruling BJP, reject the classification of Hinduism as a religion. As Richard Cohen writes, quote, the proponents of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, refuse to call Hinduism a religion precisely because they want to emphasize that Hinduism is more than mere internalized beliefs. It is social, political, economic, and familial in nature. For similar reasons, the Chinese government today excludes Confucianism from the official list of religions in China. It is seen as an expression of the national character, which is superior to religion, which is private and otherworldly. In her book, The Invention of World Religions, Tomoko Masusawa concludes, quote, "This concept of religion as a general transcultural phenomenon, yet also as a distinct sphere in its own right, is patently groundless. It came from nowhere, and there is no credible way of demonstrating its factual and empirical substantiality." I think she's wrong to say it came from nowhere. It came from the West, but you get the point. In other words, the religious secular distinction is not engraved in the nature of things. It's a distinction that is employed by Western or westernized societies to marginalize certain kinds of practices and to authorize others. So the last thing I want to talk about then is, what's it for? If the myth of religious violence is so incoherent, why is it so prevalent? Whose interests does it serve? I want to look at domestic policy and first, and then foreign policy. And most of my examples are from the US context, but I think you can see parallels elsewhere. Well into the 20th century, religion was cited in US Supreme Court cases as having a unifying social effect. And from the 1940s onwards, it was cited as a divisive social force. The first US Supreme Court decision to invoke the myth of religious violence was Minersville School District versus Gobaitis in 1940, which dealt with compulsory pledging of allegiance to the American flag. So the Jehovah's Witnesses didn't want to be forced to pledge allegiance to the American flag. They thought it was idolatry. So Justice Felix Frankfurter invokes the specter of religious wars in addressing the Jehovah's Witnesses' right to dissent. He says, "Centuries of strife over the erection of particular dogmas as exclusive or all-comprehending faiths led to the inclusion of a guarantee for religious freedom in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment sought to guard against repetition of those bitter religious struggles by prohibiting the establishment of state religion and securing to every sect the free exercise of its faith." And so he ruled in favor of the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Wrong. He says they can be forced to salute the American flag. Why? Because, he says, their dissent threatens the promotion of national cohesion. We're dealing with an interest inferior to none in the hierarchy of legal values. National unity is the basis of national security, and so on. And goes on to say that the school can impose views not shared by the parents. Now, the court would reverse itself 3 years later, but Frankfurter was the first to introduce this idea that the problem is religion is divisive, and the answer is this kind of national unity. Martin Marty discusses this case and cites the many instances in which Jehovah's Witnesses in the 1940s were attacked and beaten and tarred and castrated and imprisoned in the US because they believed that followers of Jesus Christ should not salute a flag. Now, one would think that he would draw the obvious conclusion that zealous nationalism can cause violence, but astonishingly, he concludes it became obvious that religion, which can pose us versus them, carries risks and can be perceived by others as dangerous. Religion can cause all kinds of trouble in the public arena. So what he means by religion is not the ritual vowing of allegiance to a flag, but only the Jehovah's Witnesses' refusal to do so. And so in this way, the myth of religious violence is used to draw attention away from nationalist violence and towards so-called religious violence, even though the Jehovah's Witnesses were the ones suffering the violence and not perpetuating it. In the succeeding decades, the myth of religious violence would be invoked by the Supreme Court in case after case, decisions forbidding school prayer and religious instruction on public school property and so on. A lot of these cases, I think, were rightly decided, but for the wrong reasons. When they banned school prayer in 1963, Justice Potter Stewart dissented, warning of, quote, the establishment of a religion of secularism. Interesting quote. And he noted the long history of government religious practice in the US, including the Supreme Court itself starting their sessions with "God save this honorable court." And a couple of his fellow justices responded by saying, No, there's a distinction between patriotic invocations of God and religious invocations of God. So they say there's nothing in the decision reached here that's inconsistent with the fact that school children and others are encouraged to express love for our country by reciting historical documents that contain references to God. Such patriotic or ceremonial occasions bear no true resemblance to the unquestioned religious exercise that the state has sponsored in this instance. So for them, for Goldberg and Harlan, what separates religion from what's not religion is not the invocation of God. God can be invoked as long as it's patriotic, it's love for our country. So separating religious speech from non-religious speech, in this case, depends not on the presence or absence of expressions of a faith in God, but the presence or absence of expressions of faith in the United States of America. So again, nationalism is the answer to religious divisiveness. And that brings me to foreign policy. The conventional wisdom helps to reinforce and justify Western attitudes and policies toward the non-Western world, especially Muslims. We tell ourselves that we have a peaceful, secular type of state in which religious speech has been marginalized from the public sphere, while those crazy people over there, Muslims especially, still mix religion with politics, which makes their politics peculiarly dangerous. So their violence is religious, and therefore it's irrational and divisive. Our violence, on the other hand, is secular, which means that it's rational and it's peacemaking. And so we find ourselves regrettably forced to bomb them into the higher rationality. So Christopher Hitchens, for example, he skewers religion for its violence, but he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Iraq War. He has some very approving things to say about killing people. And I say to the Christians while I'm at it, go love your own enemies, by the way, don't be loving mine. I think the enemies of civilization should be beaten and killed and defeated, and I don't make any apology for it. So for Hitchens, the Iraq War was part of a broader war for secularism, and the game is zero-sum. It's not possible for me to say, well, you pursue your Shiite dream, and I'll pursue my study of Thomas Paine and George Orwell, and the world is big enough for both of us. The true believer cannot rest until the whole world bows the knee. And by the true believer, he means the Muslims, right? But what he really means is secularists too, like himself, cannot rest until everybody has been converted to secularism by force if necessary. Fellow new atheist Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, about the violence and irrationality of religion, also illustrates this double standard. In the book, Harris condemns the religious torture of witches, but he provides his own argument for torturing terrorists. And his book is charged with the conviction that we can't argue with religious people. We have to deal with them by force. Some propositions are so dangerous it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them. Certain beliefs place their adherents beyond the reach of every peaceful means of persuasion, while inspiring them to commit acts of extraordinary violence against others. There is, in fact, no talking to some people. War is what we and other Western powers are bound to attempt at an even greater cost to ourselves and innocents abroad. Elsewhere in the Muslim world, we will continue to spill blood in what is, at bottom, a war of ideas. So his logic is that religious people hold irrational beliefs, so there's no use trying to argue with them, you can only bomb them. So the myth of religious violence becomes a justification for the use of violence. In a chapter entitled The Problem with Islam, Harris writes, there's little possibility of our having a Cold War with an Islamist regime armed with long-range nuclear weapons. In such a situation, the only thing likely to ensure our survival may be a nuclear first strike of our own. Needless to say, this would be an unthinkable crime, as it would kill tens of millions of innocent civilians in a single day, but it may be the only course of action available to us, given what Islamists believe. Before we get to that point, Harris continues, we must encourage civil society in Islamic countries but we can't trust them to vote it in, of course. So it seems all but certain that some form of benign dictatorship will generally be necessary to bridge the gap. But benignity is the key, and if it cannot emerge from within a state, it must be imposed from without. The means of such imposition are necessarily crude: economic isolation, military intervention, etc. While this may seem an exceedingly arrogant doctrine to espouse, it appears we have no alternatives. Now, Harris's book is a peculiarly blunt version of this type of justification for violence, but he's by no means isolated. His book was a New York Times bestseller. It won the 2005 Penn Award for nonfiction. It's been enthusiastically endorsed by such academic superstars as Alan Dershowitz and Richard Dawkins and Peter Singer. Now, to conclude then, I don't wish either to deny the virtues of liberalism or excuse the vices of other kinds of social orders. The Taliban is bad. ISIS is bad. There is a new dominant form of Christian nationalism in Russia with would-be imitators in Trump's orbit in the US. These are dangerous and repulsive movements, and Islam and Christianity cannot be simply excused from any responsibility. But were the Russians any less expansionist under atheist rule in the 20th century? Is Trumpism not less imperialistic than liberal American nationalism? That's the first and last nice thing about Trump I'm ever going to say, by the way. What I'm trying to do is level the playing field so that we do examine the violence that can be generated by the concept of jihad or Ruski Mir, this Russian world idea. But we also examine the violence that can be generated by ideologies of free markets and free elections. Put simply, my argument is that people kill for all sorts of things. Things like money and flags and oil and freedom that function as gods in people's lives. So I want to challenge the religious-secular dichotomy that causes us to turn a blind eye to secular forms of violence and imperialism. Insofar as the myth of religious violence creates the villains against which a liberal social order defines itself, the myth is little different than previous forms of Western imperialism that established the inferiority of non-Western others and subjected them to Western power in the hopes of making them more like us. This type of imperialism produces fundamentalism as the opposite reaction. It's too strong to say, as Robert Wright does, that the Iraq War, more than any other single factor, created ISIS. But the general point is an important one. Islamic terrorism is a response to Western intrusions into the Muslim world. The idea that religion is to blame for turmoil in the Middle East allows us to cast a fog of amnesia over the interventions of Western corporations, diplomats, and armies in the Muslim world. So much of our discourse around these issues is guided by broad stereotypes of secular people who have only facts versus mindless believers. But in the first case, I don't believe in non-believers. Everybody believes in something, right? Tell me what you believe, I'll tell you what I believe. Let's have a conversation. But in the second case, most so-called religious people are not mindless dupes. Muslims are not programmed to commit violence by a few passages in the Quran. Just as most Christians employ strategies of interpretation of sacred texts that allow them to reconcile their beliefs with science and with people from other faiths, most Muslims employ such strategies of interpretation every day. 120 leading Muslim scholars have issued an 18-page point-by-point refutation of ISIS claims based on the Quran and other authoritative Muslim texts. They accuse ISIS of cherry-picking a few verses without considering the entire Quran and Hadith. They also say that conditional passages must be distinguished from unconditional ones, unequivocal passages from allegorical ones, and all the historical circumstances of the verses have to be taken into consideration. These scholars want to take sacred texts not less seriously, but more seriously by considering them in their entirety. There are, of course, violent forms of Islam, but we should adopt an empirical approach rather than have arguments about what religion is like, or Islam is like, or Christianity as a whole is like. It's much more helpful to get as specific as possible. This particular school of Saudi Wahhabism here, this particular school of Russian Orthodox nationalism here. Dividing the world into religious and secular is not only too broad, but it's a distorted lens for viewing the world. Violence feeds on the need for enemies, the need to separate us versus them. And these binary ways of dividing the world make the world understandable for us, but it makes the world unlivable for many. So doing away with the myth of religious violence is one way of doing away with one of those binaries and perhaps turning some enemies into friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kavanagh. This was kind of a good start of a full day here at Litteraturhuset. We will now turn east and turn to the Ukraine, to Russia. And we have invited Professor Vebjørn Horsfjord to share his insights and thoughts about this war, particularly about the Russian Orthodox Church and the Patriarch Kirill's fueling the conflict and the war. As maybe some of you weren't here in the beginning, Professor Dr. Brekke is not going to be here today because he's ill, but we will have the conversation after Vebjørn's talk. Vebjørn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as you say, this is a very good start, and we could have started the discussion right away, but I'll also give a little introduction. It's a great honor to be here. It's a great pleasure always to be to participate in STL meetings, and it is an honor to be here on the podium together with Professor Kavanagh. As Ingrid said, I've been invited to share some observations and reflections pertaining to today's topic, religion and violence, with reference to the ongoing war in Ukraine and the role of religion in it, or more specifically, the role of the Orthodox Church and its leader, Patriarch Kirill, and their apparently enthusiastic support for President Putin's war. In other words, mine is not a detailed comment on Professor Kavanagh's lecture. It is rather we could say, perhaps an appendix in which I'll briefly do what Kavanagh recommended towards the end of what he said. Look at the role of religion and non-religion in specific situations rather than make sweeping claims that either blame or absolve religion in general for violence. I should say from the outset that I'm both fascinated and, to a large extent, convinced by the arguments we've just heard about religion and violence, not least the contention that in discussions on this topic, the main problem is not always disagreement about facts on the ground or about causal relationships, but rather about the concept of religion itself. However, as we heard, disagreement about concepts can lead to new facts on the ground, including legitimizing Western war efforts against the religious other. So again, this is not a comment, far less a statement of disagreement on the lecture, but I hope that you will see that there are connections between what we have just heard and what I will say. For example, concerning the religious-secular distinction, the relationship between religion and nationalism, and the relationship between church and state. But before we go into details, we could start with some uplifting words, because there won't be many of those. And I quote, "I urge everyone to pray for peace, for the Lord to reconcile peoples, nations, and states, so that the world becomes the property of the entire human race, because God has called us to peace, not war." And I think many of us can agree. This is true and peaceful religion, as it ought to be. The words are not from Dalai Lama or Mahatma Gandhi, not even from the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. They are Patriarch Kirill's in a sermon on the 8th of May of this year. But is Kirill not a staunch supporter of President Putin's war? Yes, he is. And this quote makes visible why it is worthwhile examining the mechanics of the Russian Orthodox Church's support for the war in Ukraine. If people in the West, and indeed you in this room, have heard about Kirill's support for the war, you will have heard a quote from his sermon on the 6th of March, where the Patriarch said that pride parades in Ukraine show that the ongoing war is necessary, because it is metaphysical more than material. It is a war between good and evil, and pride parades are somehow the epitome of evil. That quote, that has often been repeated in Western media, is genuine, but it is also a standalone. The Patriarch has mentioned Ukraine's pride parades only on that one occasion. You may also have picked up reports that the Patriarch has promised salvation to those who fight and die for Russia in Ukraine. Such reports also contain a kernel of truth and refer to a quote from his sermon on the 23rd of September, when partial mobilization was underway, and I quote, "The Church realizes that if someone, driven by a sense of duty, dies in the performance of military duty, then he undoubtedly commits an act equivalent to sacrifice. He sacrifices himself for others, and therefore we believe that this sacrifice washes away all the sins that person has committed." End of quote. This too is a genuine quote from the Patriarch, but also not typical. So my first concrete point about the Russian Orthodox Church and the war in Ukraine is this. Yes, the Patriarch and the leadership of the Church actively support Putin's war in Ukraine. Yes, it has something to do with pride parades. Yes, it has to do with a vision of military service, a sacrifice and martyrdom that may secure forgiveness for sins. However, that is not the core of the reasoning among Russian church leaders, and it is not the most important way whereby they contribute to the war. So what is the mechanism, the central mechanism in the church leaders' support for war? My suggestion is that the church primarily contributes in this specific situation of conflict by nurturing a worldview that makes war legitimate and even necessary. And I will say quite a bit about this worldview, and then at the end of my little lecture, comment on how it relates to what we heard from Professor Kavanaugh's earlier. For many years, Patriarch Kirill has been promoting an understanding of the world that corresponds to the clash of civilizations which Samuel Huntington described in the mid-1990s. Russia is at the center of an Orthodox civilization and exists in a constant conflict or tension with other civilizations, especially the Western civilization. The latter is characterized to some extent by Western forms of Christianity, but more, according to Russian church leaders, by secularism, even a militant sort of secularism. This core belief that Russia is at the center of a civilization animated by Orthodox Christianity and in a more or less constant conflict with the West finds expression again and again when Kirill speaks. speaks directly or indirectly about the current conflict in Ukraine. And this worldview has several dimensions. First, there is a temporal or time dimension that underlines historical continuity through the ages, or more precisely, historical continuity from Prince Vladimir's 10th century kingdom based in Kiev up until today. A notion that is repeated again and again and again is that Prince Vladimir's Kievan Rus kingdom was the beginning of Russian history, even if Moscow only appeared many centuries later. That when Vladimir accepted Christianity in 988, Russia became Christian through the so-called baptism of Kiev Rus, which, as you hear, put Kiev at the center of Russian history. Patriarch Kirill, like President Putin, likes to draw historical parallels. In his sermons, that is Kirill's, he repeatedly refers to events known from Russian history in order to throw light on today's situation. The structure of these events is always the same. Russia was under threat from outside forces, from Mongols, from Poles, from Napoleon, from Nazi Germany. But thanks to their faithfulness to God and to the fatherland, they withstood the pressure, and the enemy was driven back. The implied assumption here is that there is a Russian essence of continuity despite shifting political realities through the ages. Russia and Russians are in these versions of history, without exception, the victim hero that always acts in self-defense. As Kirill says in a sermon on the 3rd of May, quote, "We don't want to fight anybody. Russia has never attacked anyone. It is amazing that a great and powerful country has never attacked anyone. It has only defended its borders." End of quote. The second aspect of this worldview is spatial and closely related to the first. When Kirill talks about Russia, his concept of Russia does not coincide with today's Russian Federation. He tends to speak about historical Russia, Holy Russia, or with reference to the historical line from Prince Vladimir's time, Holy Rus. Kirill regularly explicitly underlines that when he talks about, for example, historical Russia, it includes Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Does this necessarily point to a concrete political ambition of forcing Ukraine and Belarus into the Russian Federation? No, he sometimes underlines that political borders need not be important. The central point is the unity of the people. Russians and Ukrainians are brothers in historical Russia. And I'm sure you will not be surprised to learn that Kirill does not always use gender-inclusive language. So in the worldview Kirill draws up when he speaks, Russia is a historical continuity on a wide territory. It is holy, and it is blessed and protected by God. Why is this so? Part of the explanation is that the people have been faithful to God in all trials, and more accurately, faithful to the church. That is important because Holy Russia has a mission in the world. And this is where the topic of pride parades comes in, or more generally, the topic of the so-called traditional values, which have been on top of Kirill's political theological agenda for the last couple of decades. Russia must protect and nurture traditional values, that is, in practice, conservative family values regarding the relationship between genders, parents and children, and opposition to LGBTQ+ rights, because these traditional values are under pressure from a powerful minority of global secular elites. And this leads us to yet another part of this worldview, the actors. Who are the victims? Who are heroes? How can Russia undertake a special military operation in Ukraine, a part of Holy Rus and against Ukrainian brothers? The answer is, as always throughout Russian history, as Kirill tells that history, that it is about self-defense against outside forces. The conflict in Ukraine is an internal conflict in historical Russia, and Ukrainians are not really to blame. Conflict is nurtured by powers that seek to weaken Russia. Who are these powers? Kirill's analysis is vague and ambiguous. Enemy of the human race, dark and hostile external forces, the evil one. Sometimes one gets the sense that we could easily substitute the US, Joe Biden, NATO, or Jens Stoltenberg for these vague terms, but they are never mentioned explicitly. On other occasions, they seem to be more cosmic forces, and that is, of course, the point. The cosmic battle and international relations are inextricably intertwined. In Kirill's world, there is one more enemy that may surprise those unfamiliar with Orthodox history, but which brings out an enmity with long historical roots, namely the Patriarch of Constantinople. That is, like many other actors in his version of current international affairs, if you like, the Patriarch of Constantinople is hardly ever mentioned by name, but his machinations in Ukraine, by fostering, as the Russian Orthodox Church leadership sees it, a schism in the Ukrainian church, tempting the faithful in Ukraine away from the true Russian church into a false church without loyalty to Moscow. This idea features very high when Kirill speaks. The situation of the church or the churches in Ukraine has agitated the Russian church leadership, as well as President Putin for years. Kirill interprets the situation of the churches in Ukraine as integral to the political situation. Church and politics cannot be distinguished. This analysis is regularly recurring in Kirill's sermons and statements. For example, when he said on the 9th of March, quote, "May the Lord help all of us, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, all peoples who came from the same root, came out of the Kiev baptismal font, to preserve our spiritual unity, to prevent the division of our church." And then, those who sought to divide the peoples began with the division of the church, forming schism in Ukraine. With this, we began to break spiritual unity, but by the grace of God, this unity is preserved. End of quote. When Kirill speaks on the topic of Ukraine, it is often impossible to distinguish between the church and the state. What befalls the church befalls Russia, and threats to Russia are threats to the church. It is a form of religio-nationalism or religio-imperialism that I find hard to categorize. So I think what I've said so far is a fairly accurate description of what Kirill says about Russia, Ukraine, and the war. Is it also a good description of what he really thinks? Does he mean what he says seriously? There's no doubt that religious leaders, as other types of leaders everywhere, say a lot of things that they don't really believe in and adjust their message to what is politically and personally expedient in a situation. However, without going into greater detail here now, I would say that I think that he and people around him mean what they say seriously. They present, as I've said, a worldview, and this worldview is also the one that structures their own thinking. So religious leaders in Russia nurture a worldview that legitimizes the war, but does that matter? Does it have any impact on decision makers or on the general public? That is a harder question to answer. My suspicion is that the church's influence on both political leaders and ordinary Russians is at least as big as that of right-wing philosophers who attract the interest of Western pundits. And as importantly, the worldview that I've described here, with its temporal and spatial dimensions, its victims and villains, is actively promoted in educational activities and in schools. Only the last few weeks in November, an organization closely linked to the church organized an exhibition about Russian history in central Moscow that was visited and hailed both by Putin and Kirill, and according to the church, had more than 20,000 school children visiting in 3 weeks. and it is now being staged in other Russian cities. Several times over the last months, Kirill has lifted up the importance of a type of theme parks on Russian history. Russia is my country, they are called, which are being established in several dozen Russian cities. Such activities, in which the church and the state cooperate, systematically instill the worldview I have described in new generations of Russians. The words patriotism, fatherland, and motherland are frequently employed. So allow me to conclude with some further reflections with reference to Professor Kavanaugh's lecture. The war in Ukraine has many and complex causes. It is not primarily about religion. At the same time, there can be no doubt that religious leaders contribute to the war with its violence in Ukraine by nurturing a worldview with strong metaphysical elements that makes the war at least legitimate and perhaps necessary. This fact must be appreciated, first of all, because it helps us to analyze the current situation and the challenges anyone who works for a lasting peace in Ukraine are up against. But also because it showcases an example of destructive religion. And not from among the usual suspects of ISIS and Taliban and Al-Qaeda or other brands of Islamic extremism, but from a Christian church. Not any Christian church, but the world's second largest church, which it is very hard for other Christians to disavow as not really Christian. Does this in any way disprove Professor Kavanaugh's suggestions earlier? I think not. Not primarily because it is very hard to move from finding patterns of religious legitimation to establishing causal links, but rather because this concrete example displays many of the ambiguities that Professor Kavanaugh talked about. Religion and nation, church and state become so intertwined that it is impossible to distinguish orthodox ideas from nationalist ones. The worldview of a clash of civilization displays continuity from 19th century religious Tsarist times through 20th century atheist Soviet Union to the 21st century revival of religion in Russia. Thus, although I'm convinced that the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in nurturing and legitimizing the war in Ukraine deserves scrutiny, I agree that it is hard to draw conclusions one way or the other from there to the relationship between violence and religion in general. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vebjørn Hosfjord, for an interesting intervention. I think we will allow ourselves to fill up the coffee cups or some water while I invite Dr. Kavanaugh and Dr. Hosfjord to the podium. And also, Professor Iselin Frydenlund has agreed to be with us for the conversation. Thank you very much for being sporty enough to join us, even though your main performance will be in the second half of the conference. So let's find our places here, and you can find some coffee and water if you like. I think we'll start now. May I invite you to find your places? Thank you. I've now introduced you as doctor and your last name 2 or 3 times. Is it okay if I switch to your first names?
Sure.
Thank you. Vebjørn, is it okay?
Well, I prefer Professor Horst.
I'll call the others by their first name, and Dr. Professor Horsfjord, if you join us, it will be fine. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. May I ask you, Bill, to start by commenting on Vebjørn's intervention, please?
Sure. I found it fascinating. I thought it was really interesting, and I learned a lot about Patriarch Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church, more beyond just the headlines. And I think what you said was exactly right, that in some ways this is exactly what I'm hoping happens, that rather than talk about does religion cause violence, does it not cause violence, is Islam or Christianity inherently violent or not, that we get down to these actual cases and look at the particular empirical examples. In this case, I think it's undeniable that you can make an argument that this form of Christianity does contribute to violence, and you're seeing that in Ukraine right now. So I think that's exactly the kind of analysis that we need to do, at the same time that we're also looking at how kind of, what is the West's role in this? What kinds of secular violence are there? If this is not just West good, Russia bad, then what other kinds of things can we say about it as well? So I thought that was really helpful. One of the most interesting things about it was the way that you pointed out that orthodoxy and patriotism are so densely intertwined that to separate religion from politics is really difficult, and I think that's an important thing to say. One of the conclusions that you could draw from that is that we just haven't separated religion from politics carefully enough there. This is an argument for why we need to separate religion from politics. Because anytime you get theology close to politics, then it's going to be bad. And one of the things that I've argued in my work is that there's nothing inherently bad about bringing politics and theology together. It's inevitable. The question is if it's good theology or bad theology, right? And so this is a case of bad theology, and we need to call it bad theology. But I don't think there's any sense of doing like Mark Lilla wants to do, to say, well, this is why we need to keep theology and politics separate. I don't think that's possible or desirable or empirically very sustainable or interesting. The question is always, is it good theology? Is it bad theology? Is it good politics? Is it bad politics? You can talk about the politics of Jesus and the ways in which, I think, the kinds of things that Pope Francis is kind of talking about. It gives you a sort of critical lens on some of the kind of oppressive things like nationalism in the world today. I'm working on a sequel to this book now on idolatry, basically teasing out the theological implications of this, the idea of idolatry, that people worship all kinds of things, and oftentimes has very dire consequences. And one of the chapters is on nationalism. And so it's precisely the kind of identification of bad theology that I think needs to happen. So thank you so much. That's just my initial reaction.
Iselin, bad theology or good theology?
Well, as a professor of the study of religion, I would leave that to the theologians, I guess. But first of all, I would like to thank Professor Kavanagh for an excellent keynote. And I'm really happy to meet you in person. I mean, we do have your book on the reading list, and we force our students to read all chapters, in fact. And yeah, and as a study of a religion person, I just have to say that I find it very hard to disagree. I mean, this is what we've been trained for, you know, since the very first course in the study of religion, that religion is a constructed category with its own, you know, legacies and trajectories. And we do read your book. We read, of course, Assad, and we do read Cantwell Smith. It's kind of the basic formation. And then the question is how and when and what are the effects of the export of these concepts, as you so brilliantly show in your book. I think what I would like to not add, but to emphasize is what both of you have been mentioning several times, and that is what I call the right sizing of religion. It's not a sort of either is religious or it's secular, but what is the role? That means, is it a small role in a given conflict, or is it a big role that religion plays in a given conflict? So that is the right sizing question. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the debates here in Norway where the question of right-sizing the role of religion has got completely lost is in the question of the role in suicide missions, or what people refer to as suicide terrorism. And I engaged in a rather heated debate with a professor of political science a few years ago, because he gave a talk at national television claiming that it was only religion that could make you know, the right motivation for people to engage in suicide terrorism. That would be the myth of religious violence argument. So as a study of religious studies, you know, it's a question of, okay, so in what ways does religion play a role for people who engage in suicide terrorism, and when does it not? And apparently people tend to believe that it's a given and it's linked to Islam. But if we look at the history of suicide terrorism, we will see that at certain times, religion is not necessary at all. You can certainly have secular nationalist motivations for people to sacrifice their lives. And I work on Sri Lanka and Myanmar. And Sri Lanka is the most important example we have of secular nationalist non-state groups, the Tamil Tigers of Tamilalam, that engaged in a particular martyrdom cult that was secularist in many ways. But it was done in a, I mean, you could use Bella's civil religion for it, but it was created in a particular language that spoke to multiple and differing religious constituencies. So a large number of the terrorist bombers in Sri Lanka were in fact Catholic. And when I say that, people get shocked and a bit provoked, and it doesn't fit into the grand narrative of the myth of religious violence. So I just want to mention it, because this kind of idea that Islam is necessary to produce suicide bombers, empirically, it's wrong. And we need to go into those specific cases to be able to understand the role that secular nationalism or religion can play in the production of suicide missions. So I just wanted to mention it as an example that fits in with your debunking of grand narratives.
I've heard that before, that the Tamil Tigers kind of invented suicide bombing. Is that too much to say, or is that accurate? It's
a kind of a global circulation of ideas beginning in Lebanon, you know, in 82. Also by more secular-oriented people And then it was exported to Sri Lanka, and they refined it in many ways. So they can claim, I don't know, the honor of having invented the suicide belt that you can put under the dress. Yeah. But the point is that I want to make is that if one goes into and make these kind of close-up studies, you will see that interplay of the religious and the secular, and the ways in which that these categories are negotiated at a very micro level, and the ways in which that the leader, Velupillai Prabhakaran, how he knew how to speak with both a language that spoke to the Catholics, it spoke to the Hindus, and it spoke to the secular nationalists, and it's done in an extremely clever way. Yeah.
Interesting.
So Vebjørn, even though religion might not be the, more responsible for wars than the non-religious secular movements, does the religions have more responsibility, to prevent it, or to that's a kind of a given. You can answer yes, no, but can you elaborate a little bit on that?
More or less, I think we have the same responsibility, all of us. But it's interesting. I immediately think of that first quote that I opened with from Kirill about us praying for peace, and well, I don't have it here, but that we should be together as one human race and all pray for peace. And that is something that he and religious leaders everywhere, I think, regularly say. So that seems to indicate that there is an understanding among many religious leaders that this is something religions should do. And still, and that was my point in the lecture, what he goes on to do and repeatedly does is, in our analysis, really the opposite. So it doesn't really help. Again, I think it is an argument in favor of what is one of Professor Kavanaugh's overall main points, that operating on this very general level in many situations, on many topics, doesn't really help. Also, saying nice things about religions working for peace doesn't really achieve much, because the devil is, if not in the detail, at least on the lower level, on the concrete analysis of a situation, of a concrete analysis of, in this case, the history of Russia and who are the actors and what is Ukraine's role in relation to Russia through history and so forth. So I didn't answer your question, but I said something about religion and peace on a general level, which I think is sometimes not very useful, and I think Kirill demonstrates that.
Did you try to... No?
I guess I have a question for both of you, I guess. Could we possibly turn the question around and argue that religion, in fact, has prevented violence to a large extent? I mean, if we think in terms of just word tradition, which is not really about justifying violence, but to put constraints on the use of violence.
Yeah, I mean, again, I wouldn't want to answer that question yes or no, because I don't know what this thing called religion is that we're talking about, right? So I'm going to want to kind of take it down to a lower level than that and talk about, Christianity, for example. And the answer is yes. It has promoted violence, and yes, it has promoted peace, right? And so as a theologian, I'm going to want to bring out what I think is at the root of it, which is peace, right? The idea that God takes flesh among us and dies rather than kills, and comes back and does not take revenge, but says, peace be with you. That is at the core of Christianity to me. And that, as a theologian, is what I'm going to take on. So that's the distinction that I made at the beginning, is the normative and the descriptive, right? It's imperative for Muslims to say that ISIS has got Islam wrong, it's imperative for Christians to say the Crusaders have got Christianity wrong on the normative level. On the descriptive level, it's not that easy, and you can't just say, oh, they're not really Christians, right? That just excuses our own selves. So we need to be very realistic about the history that we're telling and not try to create a kind of sanitized version of Christianity. At the same time that as a Christian theologian, I need to be amplifying the voices of peace from within the Christian tradition and trying to locate peace at the very core of the Christian tradition. And so that's my job as a theologian, right? And not just because I think it's useful, but because I think it's true, right? And other people are going to, find different ways into that, but that's at the center of it. So when I talk about bad theology and good theology, I don't want to get away from the issue of what's actually true and what's not actually true. It's obviously difficult, but I don't think that we do anybody any favors by trying to pretend that we're not talking about what we actually think is most true about the universe.
Weber?
I was thinking further along the lines of responsibility for religion, for peace, and I think it's hard to say that religion in general has, we've discussed that, but religious actors can have a role, and if you are a religious actor, and I think it's possible to point at specific people saying that they represent structures and organizations that are religious, their responsibility is within the fields that they operate. And therefore it's interesting in concrete situations and to look at how religious actors in that situation, for example in Sri Lanka or in Russia or elsewhere, what is their contribution, big or small, to conflict, to peace, and how religious actors elsewhere may influence them. So I think it's more interesting perhaps to look at the concrete actors. I looked at Patriarch Kirill and the circle around him and how they operate, what they do, than on these more general concepts of religion or orthodoxy.
So what about the interreligious work then? STL, our organization has for 26 years been working with on very low level, not internationally, but nationally and locally, gathering religious leaders and religious groups and non-religious groups also for dialogue and work for common interests. And we often say that this it's not easy to prove our success, because what happened if the bishop didn't talk with the rabbi and the imam? It's not easy to prove our success. But so how can the interreligious dialogue be helpful in ways of promoting the peace?
Well, when we worked together on this many years ago, Ingrid, we used to say that the important thing is that religious leaders have each other's mobile phone numbers. And that was a way to say exactly that. It is the concrete actors can reach each other, can build trust among themselves, can understand each other, can contact each other in specific situations. And that was going to lead to something, but I forget. Yes, and this is a situation that we see. Sorry for speaking about Russia all the time, but the World Council of Churches is in that situation right now. How should they, as Christians, church leaders from around the world, relate to the Russian church leadership? And that is the big challenge that they had to handle during the General Assembly of the World Council of Churches in September. Some want to exclude or suspend the Russian Orthodox Church from the World Council of Churches. Others want to keep them inside in order to continue a conversation, a dialogue. And I think different actors on different arena may choose different paths here. And we have, at the moment, a very very tough sanctions against Russia in most fields, there may be good arguments for saying that, okay, let's then try for the churches to keep up some form of contact into central parts of Moscow, to the patriarch who is close to Putin, although we, find his actions and what he says and does repulsive, but still perhaps there could be, if not much influence, at least a form of communication that might also help us on the outside to understand what is going on. So that is the type of concrete contact situations that I believe are more important, more useful than these general statements that often come out of interreligious meetings that I have rather some hesitation about.
Bill, just a second. I will open the floor to everybody in just a few minutes. So if you'd like to, try to find up very good, excellent questions, not long comments, but precise, excellent questions, that would be helpful. Bill.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
I was a few years ago asked to contribute to a volume called The Blackwell Companion on Violence and Religion, or Religion and Violence. And I titled my contribution, Why This Volume is a Very Bad Idea. And they made me change the title. They changed the title. But the reason it was a bad idea is because there's never going to be a Blackwell companion to secular ideologies and violence, right? It's always, and that's part of the problem with this question of interreligious dialogue, is that we assume that we need to get the Christians and the Muslims and the Hindus talking to each other, and that's going to kind of, it's going to work, it's going to create things. And I think that's great, and I think that's all very good. But what's really interesting about your organization is that it's not just what are traditionally considered religions. You've got the religious and life stance communities in the same organization, and you haven't segregated them into religious and secular, and you're dealing with each other on an equal basis. And that, I think, is really interesting and really hopeful, so that you've done away with one of these binaries that I think is really unhelpful and creates so much misunderstanding and division. I'm a believer and you're a non-believer, or vice versa, right? You've got all these people with different beliefs in the same organization, and you're speaking to each other as equals. And I think that in itself is a huge accomplishment. So thank you for doing that.
Isla?
On the interreligious dialogue, well, who can be not in favor of that in a way? But I think that we also need to have a critical take on it. And the reason for saying so is that the context where I work, Sri Lanka and Myanmar, I have so many examples of how interreligious dialogue function at a specific elite level, but with no sort of real substance to the ground whatsoever. And it's also instrumentalized on the part of the state. And it's not really aimed at finding real solutions. It's really just talk and not walking the walk in a way. So I think we have to be aware of it. And there's obvious gender dimensions to this as well. It's very, male dominated, and average age beyond 65 plus, so it's a certain, part of the population that takes part in these kind of projects. But that doesn't mean that they can play an extremely important role in certain times of crisis, and they have done in the case of Myanmar. Like Buddhist monks coming out and saying that, well, it's not against Buddhism to visit a mosque. Very simple statements that came as a kind of a shocking truth in this kind of massive state-sponsored Islamophobia in Myanmar. So, yeah, yes and no. Yeah.
Vebjørn?
And I think, as Bill says about there's bad theology and good theology, there's bad interreligious work, and there's good interreligious work. And again, my friend Kirill is a great believer in interreligious dialogue. He promotes interreligious cooperation a lot, and we shouldn't go into that now, but he very often talks about the very good relationships between the traditional religions of Russia. So this is not an exclusive Christian type of discourse. And the good thing about interreligious cooperation among Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Muslims, traditional religions of Russia, is that they can cooperate to promote the traditional values, to stop LGBTQ plus rights, for example, to work to ensure that the state won't interfere in families if fathers beat their children or their wives, that kind of traditional values that religions promote. So he's a great fan of interreligious dialogue. I don't necessarily agree with that kind of interreligious efforts.
Made me remember another quote from when we worked together, and that was when religious leaders talk to each other, sometimes it gets better, sometimes it gets worse, and sometimes it's just the same. Please, can you please introduce yourself and also maybe point to whom you are addressing the question to, please?
Thank you so much. My name is Sturla Stålseth. I'm a professor of religion and society and diaconal studies at MF School of Theology and Religion here and Society, with Iselin as a colleague, good colleague. Thank you so much, all the three of you, of excellent contributions, and particularly Professor Kavanaugh. It was a great pleasure to hear you, and we use your work, and we admire very much that work. I would like to challenge your distinction, or your dissolution of the distinction between the secular and the religious, because I find your argument very convincing, and hence it's interesting to go against, try to push it the other way, because I think, being in the framework of STL, I think your point about STL not living on binaries is not completely correct, because life stands in this connection is belief. So it's the religion and belief on the one side and the secular on the other side. There's a point in this cooperation saying that there is something particular, something sui generis, with what we call religion and belief, which is worthwhile cooperating, worthwhile protecting, also politically. And it's an argument for the state to protect and support and promote this kind of public cooperation as something particular. And that makes me wonder, what is the cost, the possible cost, of dissolving the religion-secular distinction altogether as a kind of myth? And I wonder whether or not you're actually drawing on the kind of distinction that you wish to dissolve when you call it a myth of religious violence. So just that's my main point. I want both as a value, the positive side of religion and belief that needs to be protected, and as a kind of right. It's there in the human rights. What is it when it's a protection of religion and belief and as distinct from something else? And a very last point is on your work on your critique of Juergensmeyer, which I also find interesting. But his main point is that the cosmic war should not be migrating, to use your term, into the political. And isn't that actually also pointing to a necessity of distinguishing between religion and the secular, where the secular comes as safeguarding religious ideas from becoming dangerously violent in politics? Thank you.
Well.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Yeah. No, those are excellent questions. Thank you. And there's a lot there to respond to. So let me see if I can get this right. So I do what I mean, what I said about STL is probably my version of STL, and not I mean, what do I know about STL, right? I just got off the plane last night at 11 o'clock, right? So,
What?
But I like the idea that, I like this idea of life stances because it tends to put things on equal footing. So in some ways, I would want to just call it life stances rather than religious and life stances, right? In some ways, I want to just say, let's use this kind of overarching term because it brings us together. But your question about whether I want to dissolve the religious-secular distinction entirely is an interesting one. And I've had pushback on this before. I gave a lecture about this, and a guy approached me and said, look, I teach religious studies at the University of Virginia. This is Thomas Jefferson's university. Knock it off, or you're going to put me out of a job, right? And so it made me realize that, yeah, you know, if the term religion allows for theology to happen at this very secular Enlightenment university, then I'm for it, right? So I think we need to be sort of flexible. I had the same sort of thing. I gave a talk on this at the Department of Political Science at University of California, Berkeley, very secular state university. And one of the graduate students said to me afterwards, he said, look, you know, we've tried for years to try to get them to take religion seriously at this very secular university, and here you come and are pulling the rug out from underneath us. And I thought, yeah, you know, that's right. There's something, so there are times at which this term religion can do useful work. And so I think we need to be very kind of empirical about these sorts of things and not dogmatic about it. There are some people like Timothy Fitzgerald who just wants to abolish the term religion and use something else. And I just don't think you can do that. It has a history. You just always have to be aware of what it's being used for. Is it being used for a good purpose? Is it being used for a bad purpose? Is it being used in a neutral way, right? To distinguish what I'm doing in church from what I'm doing in my garden, you know, sure, that's fine, right? What we need to do, though, I think, is we need to be able to say that religion, or the religious-secular distinction more accurately, the religious-secular distinction is not a thing out there in the world. The religious-secular distinction is not this, it's this, right? It's a lens through which you read the world, and it's a constructed lens. And the main difference is that these lenses help me see more clearly, right? Whereas usually the religious-secular distinction distorts things and blurs things. But we need to stop talking about it as if it were just this thing out in the world. And we need to look at, you know, anytime we use this distinction, we need to look at what kind of uses it's being put to, and you know, for what reasons and why. Is it doing good work or is it doing bad work? Now, the further point you're making about politics is an important point. And as I say in the book, I'm in favor of the separation of church and state, right? I'm not in favor of the separation of religion and politics, right? I think that what I believe about Jesus has a lot to do with the real world. And so I don't think that, you know, religion, you know, Christianity is for Sundays and, you know, politics is for Monday through Friday. And so in that sense, those are the more precise distinctions that I want to make. I do think that the separation of church and state is a good idea, but I think that primarily for theological reasons, right? That it's bad for Christians to wield weapons, you know, to wield weapons of coercion. But I don't think there's any, I don't have any particular stake in identifying something called religion that needs to be kept separate from politics. I don't do what Juergensmeyer does, and I don't think that's very helpful, because you can have cosmic you know, he's got this distinction between the mundane and the cosmic, but as you can see from my quotes, that distinction falls apart in the course of his own analysis. Marxism is as cosmic as you know, Russian Orthodoxy is. You know, what do you mean by cosmic, right? Meaning kind of this overarching worldwide sense of the destiny of history and so on. Well, Marxism is just as cosmic as Christianity is in that sense. So I just don't find that distinction very persuasive.
Thank you. I think we have at least 2, maybe 3 here. 1, 2, and 3. I think we take all of those, and then you can answer because time is running.
Hello, I'm Gunnar K2 from the Oslo Buddhist Center. Very much appreciated all your contributions. And I wonder, particularly to Bill and Vebjørn, about building this a new narrative. You know, on what could we, on what common ground that is non-elitist can we build this common narrative? And in particular with regard to values or virtues. And I'm thinking of like Dalsgaard and some psychologists. They dug out 6 virtues that they found common in the main religions. And then also experientially, Bill, you mentioned about this cosmic. And I just wondered if you could say something about a distinction between maybe a purely materialist worldview, where there isn't something bigger, and some experientially, where there is a bigger perspective somehow. Yeah. So if any of that can make grounds for a common ground.
Keep that in mind.
My name is Dagfinn Eckhoff. I have been an atheist all my life. There was no God in my mother's womb. And I can't remember when I met the religious stories, I felt there were fairy tales. There were fairy tales in my childhood. Then I met God in primary school. And I left these lectures as an atheist. I met my old favorite from my childhood on TV, Uncle Lauritz, he was his name. I didn't know he was a Christian, but then he was telling about the story about the Jews, how they got into the promised land. He said, people lived there from before, you know, so they had to fight then, you know. And I was terrified. And my question is, what do we do about the stories in religion that are frightening and leading to violence?
Thank you. In the back.
My name is Lars Gule. I'm recently retired philosopher, but also former Secretary General of the Norwegian Humanist Association. First, I should ask the questions that Professor Kavanaugh answered, because we do have a phenomenon called religion. We do have a phenomenon that is secular, and we need to define these. And that's when the problem starts, because then we realize that it is hard to define, and especially hard to define concepts that are absolute. They will be frayed at the edges, and then it's tempting to dissolve them, but at the same time, we do need to catch the phenomena that the definitions are meant to catch. Then we will have to navigate that problem. And in that sense, I think you have answered the question. So my second question is, can religion limit violence? If it promotes violence, if it stops violence, that's one thing. But how can it regulate violence? And has it contributed to that? That is my question. And I'm, of course, referring to concepts of just war and jihad. Attempts to regulate. Would you comment on that? And I would be interested in Vebjørn's knowledge about Kirill's concept of just war, if he has one. Thank you.
Okay, I think you will answer the questions as you know were meant for you or that you want to answer. I will start with Iselin, then go to Vebjørn, and then end with Bill.
All right,
Okay.
I think most of the questions were for Kavanagh and Horsfjord here, but if I could just say one thing about what do we do with narratives. The narratives in themselves do not necessarily cause violence, right? I mean, there are just so many narratives out there that are not necessarily linked to direct actions of violence, and the other way around. And that's my main point. I work on Buddhism, and I've been working on debunking the myth of Buddhist pacifism for the last 20 years. Buddhism, you know, it entails violence in all possible contexts without necessarily having great narratives to support it. So I think a good place to start is to sort of de-link actual violence from narratives. Again, it's an empirical question. So this is what we call textual reductionism, and I will talk about that in my lecture in the next session. You know, that this insistence that narratives in themselves are so important, that is something for us to discuss, I think.
Thank you. Vebjørn?
Yes, thank you. I'll address these questions, all of them, I think, with a reference again to Russia and Ukraine. I'll start with the question about stories of in the religions that are violent, contain violence, which is, of course, if I understand correctly, what we'll discuss after the break in the part two of this seminar. But it strikes me again that when I read, and as you understand, I've been reading all Patriarch Kirill's sermons of the last 10, 11 months. And he very rarely refers to that kind of stories that legitimate violence, for example, well, in the Bible or from among the church fathers and saints where the Orthodox tradition draw their authoritative stories from. What we hear about in the sermons is the Good Samaritan, all these stories about peace and harmony among people. And his vision is that we must implement this also in Russia and Ukraine, and unfortunately we need to use a little bit of violence on the way. So he's not nurtured, it seems to me, by stories that in themselves seem problematic. And this perhaps takes me to Lars Kule's question, which I cannot really answer very well, but because as far as I'm aware, Kirill doesn't have a clear teaching on just war, but there are documents to which he has contributed very substantially, where they discuss war and peace and religion, especially this document from 2000 that Kirill basically wrote, 22 years old, but it stands there as the Russian Orthodox Church's concept on social issues. And there they discuss war and peace too. And that looks a bit like what we know as a just war doctrine from other Christian traditions. What we can extrapolate, I think, from what he says in the current situation is exactly the same thing, that in specific situations, in self-defense, and the current situation is a situation of self-defense, there is a need to use to use the military, to use armed forces, but we need to do it as little as possible, to be as careful as possible, and take all the care we can to protect civilians and so forth, which he regularly says, and he regularly prays for civilians, and that there must be as few victims as possible and little violence as possible. But unfortunately, a little violence is needed because it is self-defense against the evil forces from outside. So that is a bit of a just war doctrine, I think, underlying what he says. The last point about constructing narratives, new narratives, is that's harder for me to really answer, but I think perhaps without specific reference to Russia, my personal belief when it comes to that kind of issues is that it is more useful for different religious traditions to develop narratives, not to seek common interreligious narratives really, but that it can be very useful if Christians, Muslims, Jews, whoever, develop their narratives, and religion is very much narratives, develop them in conversation with each other, in dialogue with each other, with knowledge of and understanding of what others think. Well, that's a vague answer to that one, but that's what I believe.
Thank you. Bill.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, these efforts to kind of identify 6 virtues that are present in all, different kinds of faith and so on, I think those can be useful to a certain extent to identify commonalities and talk about them. But I wouldn't want that to displace, I want to echo what you just said, I wouldn't want that to kind of try to displace the particularity of each of the different life stances, faiths, whatever. Because I just don't think there is this kind of Esperanto that we can all kind of get to that's neutral behind all of the particularities. I think the particularities are beautiful, and what we really need to do is learn to appreciate the particularities of other people's lives rather than trying to kind of iron everything out into a kind of neutrality. And so that kind of leads to this other point about narratives as well. I don't think narratives are the problem, and I agreed with both of you here. There are different kinds of narratives. There are good narratives and there are bad narratives, but I haven't met anybody yet who doesn't have a narrative, including atheists, right? I mean, there are atheist narratives. The Soviet Union operated under an atheist narrative for 70 years, right? And it wasn't any less violent than so-called religious narratives, right? You can kill people because you believe a God is ordering you to kill people. You can also kill people because you believe that there is no God, and so you are God, basically. You are the highest authority, and Stalin, I think, would have thought that was that, he can do what he wants because there's nothing. I mean, all of these things are possible, right? So I don't think there's anything in particular about a narrative or about a narrative about a god or gods that is particularly divisive or violent. We just need to talk about which. Tell me what your narrative is, and I'll tell you what my narrative is, and then we can talk about where we can walk together. That seems to me to be the most fruitful way of going about it. The last question then was about this trying to get our definitions right. I don't want to. I think that's what we've been trying to do, and I think it's not getting us anywhere, right? We think that there really is something out there called religion. We can't, it's like a planet way out there that we kind of have an idea about, but we haven't got our instruments close enough to measure it yet. I think that's the wrong way to think about religion, and it's more, again, this is the point of the analogy, you know, that it's a lens. This distinction is a lens through which we view the world, and not a thing out there that eventually we're going to agree on a definition of. And I think that may have been where you were getting by the end of your question. But then the other question is, can religion kind of limit violence? And again, what do you mean by religion, right? But there are traditions like just war traditions that usually, oftentimes, just end up justifying violence, but at least theoretically can put limits on it. And I think those kind of things need to be encouraged. But I don't think this is a problem which is peculiar to, you know, Russian Orthodoxy, for example, right? Unless you are a principled pacifist who would disband the Norwegian military tomorrow and so on. Everybody needs to deal with this question of when do you think violence is justified and when is it not? And I don't think that's a peculiar question for Christians or anybody else. It's a question for everybody, right? I mean, that's one of the things I'm arguing, is that the problem is violence, right? It's not religious violence, it's not secular violence. The problem is violence, and that's where we need to concentrate our efforts.
Thank you. And thank you, all three of you, Dr. Kavanagh, Dr. Horsfjord, and Dr. Frydenlund, for a very interesting morning, I would say, under the headline, Does religion promote violence? We will have a short break now, or not a short break, a good break, 20 minutes. And then we will come back and turn to Norwegian and have a lecture from Iselin Frydenlund, and also religious leaders will share with us their difficult verses from their holy scriptures. And then we will also award the STL Dialogue Prize 2022 to a very deserved laureate. So stay tuned. Have some coffee and refreshments in the back. And thank you very much. You will have these very nice presents. Yeah. So, you are.
Did you say that the next part is going to be indoor?
Hallo? Kjære alle sammen. Det jo veldig hyggelig at folk har dialog, da. Det må vi vel kunne innrømme i STL. Men nå prøver vi med litt dialog fra scenen igjen. Jeg håper alle har hatt en god pause og klare for del 2 av årskonferansen. Her skal Mikael Gritzmann fra Det mosaiske trossamfunn, Annette Dreyer fra Den norske kirke og Senaid Koblika fra Muslimsk dialognettverk ta for seg vanskelige vers fra sine hellige skrifter som omhandler krig og vold. Til å innlede så skal professor Iselin Frydenlund fra MF Vitenskapelige Høgskole komme opp, og hun holdt hovedforedraget, som dere kanskje husker på fjorårets årskonferanse, om religioners ulike måter å forholde seg til autoritære regimer på. Og den russiske kirken var et av eksemplene som ble omtalt. Og dette var altså mindre enn 3 måneder før invasjonen av Ukraina fant sted. Iselin vil reflektere over året som har gått, før vi får vanskelige vers. Vær så god, Iselin.
Yes. Tusen takk for invitasjonen til å komme tilbake. Det jo et stort privilegium, da. Det må jeg jo virkelig få lov til å si. Og det også et privilegium, og det sa jeg også i fjor, det å kunne være akademiker og snakke i et offentlig rom uten å være redd for hva som kommer til å skje med meg, mine samarbeidspartnere, venner eller familie. Og jeg må bare få insistere på denne luksusen det å leve i et liberalt demokrati, med alle feil og mangler det måtte inneha, men sammenlignet med de kontekstene jeg jobber i, så må jeg bare få si det veldig høyt. Altså forskningen min, den handler, og har handlet over lang tid egentlig, om forholdet mellom nasjonalisme, politikk og vold, og da i buddhistiske kontekster. Så i den der tradisjonen debunking myths, det jo der jeg har vært veldig lenge da. Og nå i det siste så har jeg vært veldig opptatt av forholdet mellom religion og autokratisering, altså når religion med på å bygge ned demokratier, og det var det jeg snakket om i fjor. Og da ble jeg etterpå invitert av Kirke og Kultur til å publisere det foredraget som en artikkel, så hvis noen interessert i å lese det som var hovedinnlegget i fjor, så det publisert i Kirke og Kultur i juni-utgaven. Det jeg gjorde da var at jeg snakket litt om demokratiforskningen, og det det jeg skal gjøre litt nå også, og så får vi veldig mye etterpå om vanskelige vers og vanskelige tekstsnutter og sånn, men jeg skal prøve å skissere opp et litt sånn større bilde da, om hvordan det politiske landskapet ser ut internasjonalt. Og i fjor så brukte jeg da tallene fra Videm, som en svær internasjonal database, produsert av Universitetet i Göteborg. Det var da tallene for 2020 som var ute, og nå det tallene for 2021 som jeg skal legge litt frem. Og så vil det jo være noe fra 2022 i dette også da. Men jeg tenker at det ganske så dystre bildet som jeg skisserte opp i fjor, det har ikke blitt bedre, snarere tvert imot. Så det vi på en måte da ser da, forskningstallene på demokratisering og autokratisering, altså det at det går i en ikke-demokratisk retning, i 2021 og delvis 2022 da, det viser at de siste 30 årene med demokratisering, begynnende da i 1989, reversert. Helt. Vi altså tilbake på 1989-nivå. Bare 13% av verdens befolkning lever i liberale demokratier. Diktaturer på fremmarsj. Og den siste 10 årene så har andelen av verdens befolkning som lever i autokratier økt fra 49 til 70%. Så det på en måte derfor jeg så opptatt av dette privilegiet ved å stå her og snakke fritt, for det veldig få faktisk forunt. Et annet viktig trekk som den demokratiforskningen viser, at av de 10 landene som tydeligst går i autokratisk retning, så ledes det av autoritære partier som antipluralister, altså anti-mangfoldsagenda. Og det også verdt å tenke på. Det gjelder India, Brasil, Ungarn, Polen, Serbia og Tyrkia. Altså autokratisering, det ikke noe som skjer langt borte, altså India eller USA også ganske geografisk sett langt borte, og Brasil, men det skjer altså inne i EU. Så dette mye nærmere enn det vi kanskje liker å tenke. Et trekk som Widem-forskerne peker på at autokratisering ser ut til å ta en litt annen utforming enn det vi har sett før. Og her forskningen litt åpen, men de peker på noen tendenser, og det tenker jeg at det skal vi lytte godt til. Altså i 2021 så viste det en økning i antall militærkupp. Det var 5 militærkupp og 1 selvkupp på 1 år, og det utgjør altså kupprekord. Og 4 av de kuppene førte til lukkede autokratier, altså form for diktaturer. Og Myanmar, som jeg jobber veldig mye med, blitt nå et slikt lukket autokrati. En annen ting de finner denne giftige polariseringen i det offentlige ordskiftet, og de forsker på det veldig, veldig empirisk orientert, og ser at disse tallene har økt dramatisk de 10 siste årene. Det de også ser at det en klar sammenheng mellom den giftige polariseringen og hvem som kommer til makten. Og det altså autoritære krefter som vinner på en sånn giftig polarisering. Det man også ser klare desinformasjonskampanjer. Det kjenner vi jo fra amerikansk valgkamp, men statistisk sett så ser det ut til at dette her kanskje et enda større problem i MENA, altså Midtøsten og Nord-Afrika-regionen. Og så det siste punktet som de løfter frem i år, og det enda mer bekymringsfullt, synes jeg. Det altså folkelig mobilisering mot autokratisering lav. Folk står altså ikke imot, mens det vi ser en økende grad av pro-autoritær mobilisering. Altså når man ser folk ute på gata, så står det ofte da pro-statlige eller statlige aktører bak den form for mobilisering. Og alt dette peker mot det vi kan kalle for autoritær selvsikkerhet. Og et mer dramatisk eksempel på en slik autoritær selvsikkerhet vel Russlands invasjon av Ukraina 24. februar i år. Det det tydeligste eksempelet vi kan finne på denne form for autoritær selvsikkerhet. Og Vebjørn har jo snakket klokt og detaljert om hvilken støttende rolle den russisk-ortodokse kirken har spilt da, for Putins regime. Hva det vi kan si da, om religioners rolle i den type prosesser? Altså ved årskonferansen i fjor så snakket jeg om de ulike rollene hinduisme og buddhisme spiller for den autoritære vendingen i land som India, Sri Lanka og Myanmar. Jeg har snakket om hvordan Modi i økende grad fremstilles som en nasjonens guru, og hvordan Myanmars juntaleder blitt erklært å være ikke bare buddhismens høye beskytter, men også en bodhisattva, altså en kommende buddha. Vi ser altså klare strategier for å legitimere politisk makt ved å tillegge politiske ledere supramenneskelige kvaliteter. Jeg snakket også om økende press på religiøse minoriteter og endringer i lovverket som rammer særlig muslimske minoriteter. Det handler om regulering av flerreligiøse ekteskap gjennom såkalte anti-love jihad-lover, og statlig regulering av ekteskap, og dette ser vi da særlig i India og Myanmar, eller statlig forbud mot jordfestelse og innføring av tvungen kremasjon av døde kropper, som vi så i Sri Lanka, som var spesielt vanskelig for Sri Lankas muslimske minoriteter. Jeg jobber nå med et nytt forskningsprosjekt hvor vi prøver å forstå buddhismens rolle både for motstand og støtte til militærkuppet i Myanmar. Og forskningsspørsmål da, som skaper viss sånn hodebry, I hvilken grad disse skillelinjene baserte på teologiske eller politiske skillelinjer, I den grad et slikt skille gir mening for aktørene selv. Og da vi tilbake igjen til Kavanaughs poeng, altså hvem det som definerer hva som religion, og hva det sekulære Og kanskje det sånn at vi kan forstå de ulike posisjonene I det burmesiske landskapet, altså hvis vi liksom zoomer inn på ett land nå da, som har hatt militærkupp og blitt et lukket autokrati, kanskje kan vi finne ulike posisjoner og tradisjoner som kan gi svar på det her. Og I boken Torture and the Eucharist, som kanskje enda mer kjent enn The Myth of Religious Violence, som Kavanaugh har gitt ut, så fremsier han et veldig godt argument for hvordan bestemte teologiske posisjoner kan forklare den katolske kirkens manglende motstand mot militærdiktaturet I Chile. Altså, hvordan kunne kirken stå og se på dette her? Og det litt det samme spørsmålet som vi har når vi prøver å forstå hva som skjer I Myanmar. Altså det finnes ulike politiske teologier I Theravada-buddhismen som brukes og forstås ulikt, men om de meningsforskjellene kan reduseres til ulike politisk-teologiske posisjoner ikke helt klart så langt I vårt forskningsprosjekt. Vi ser riktig nok at ulike buddhistiske ledere forstår seg innenfor ulike fortolkningsrammer for hva som regnes som rett autoritet. Hvor skal makten egentlig ligge? Hos autoritære regimer som spiller på tradisjonelle religiøse referanser, eller skal makten være forankret I folket? Og kan politiske visjoner om folkesuverenitet finne støtte I tradisjonell politisk teologi? Og her går debatten. Og vi finner begge deler. Men det vi finner, mer enn noe annet enn ulike teologiske posisjoner, det en voldsom kritikk av de sosioøkonomiske bindingene mellom stat og klosterorden som militæret har bygget opp siden slutten av 1980-tallet. Så det viktigste funnet vi har så langt at vi ser en skuffelse og mistillit blant vanlige folk I forhold til religiøse ledere og institusjonell religion. For dem det ikke snakk om å bare bli kvitt militærjuntaen. Den burmesiske motstandsbevegelsen, som nå forstår seg som en revolusjonær kraft som skal transformere gamle hierarkier og bygge en ny og inkluderende stat, for dem så handler det om å transformere hele samfunnet, inklusiv institusjonell religion. Og I dette ligger det en mulighet for religiøs endring I form av nye religiøse bevegelser, men også sekularisering. Fordi ledende buddhistiske aktører støtter juntaen, vender mange lekfolk seg bort fra institusjonalisert religion. Det for tidlig å si noe om utfallet av denne dragkampen om buddhismens fremtid, men en ting klart, og det at autokratisering og militærkupp har ført til enorme spenninger internt I burmesisk buddhisme. Religiøse ledere verden over må altså tenke gjennom sin egen posisjon. Hva gjør vi hvis vårt samfunn tar en autoritær vending? Hvilke muligheter har vi til å stå imot? Og hvordan kan vi identifisere hvilken rolle religion spiller I nedbygging av demokratier? Hva det vi egentlig skal se etter? Og til det siste spørsmålet så vil jeg jo si at som religionsforsker som har jobbet I lang tid mellom forholdet mellom religion og vold, så vil jeg vektlegge følgende, og det avslutningen. For å forstå religioners rolle I autokratiseringsprosesser vi nødt til å utfordre tekstdominansen I vår forståelse av religion. Vi kan forstå en del av fortolkningsrammeverket ved å se på skrifttradisjon og artikulert politisk teologi, men etter mitt syn skal vi vokte oss vel for det jeg kaller for tekstlig reduksjonisme. Skal vi klare å identifisere på hvilken måte religion spiller en rolle og kan medvirke til nedbygging av demokratier, må vi se med kritisk blikk på religion som sosialt felt, innvevd I mange ulike samfunnsområder, som utdanning, økonomi og statsadministrasjon, og vi må ha et kritisk blikk på religioners performative aspekter, altså hvordan legitimeres autokratisering gjennom rituelt språk. Altså, helt avslutningsvis, gjennom de tidig empirisk arbeid vi altså nødt til å avdekke de bitte små skrittene som på lang sikt kan bringe svært galt av sted. Det var det jeg hadde nå. Takk for taletid. Og så skal vi vel ha et lite panel her. Og da vil jeg gjerne invitere Senaid Koblika, som da representerer Muslimsk dialognettverk, styreleder der, og styremedlem i STL. Og så vil jeg gjerne invitere Mikael Gritsmann fra Det mosaiske trossamfunn, leder av informasjonstiltak mot antisemittisme. Og vi vil gjerne invitere Anette Dreyer fra Den norske kirke, prest i Østre Aker og Haugerud menighet, og også i STL Oslo. Rådet, nemlig. Takk. Og da tenker jeg at vi tar 5 minutter hver, med en liten refleksjon, og så har vi en samtale oss imellom, og så åpner vi samtale med salen. Og da skal vi begynne med deg, Anette, og så følger vi. Ja.
Hører dere meg greit? Ja. Vanskelige tekster. Det er dessverre ikke så vanskelig å finne de. Og de tekstene jeg har med meg, noen av de hører man med en gang at det er en vanskelig tekst. Andre trenger man litt mer kontekst for, så jeg tenker at jeg skal gå gjennom 3, kanskje 4 tekster som jeg har tatt med fordi de er vanskelige. Og den ene er fra Johannes' åpenbaring. Og her er en kjær tekst for veldig mange kristne, leses i veldig mange begravelser. Og kontekst her altså det er eschatologisk, det handler om himmelriket som skal komme, altså endetiden. Og det er jo allegorisk. Og samtidig så er det veldig konkrete voldsbilder som brukes. Og det her leser jeg på under overskriften straffe- og voldsbilder som en del av den religiøse tradisjonen. Og da dermed altså en kontrastering av hvordan verden er, hvem som er innenfor og hvem som er utenfor, og hvordan disse beskrivelsene er. Så det begynner ganske vakkert. Og jeg så en ny himmel og en ny jord, for den første himmel og den første jord var borte, og havet fantes ikke mer. Og jeg så den hellige byen, det nye Jerusalem, stige ned fra himmelen, fra Gud, gjort i stand og pyntet som en brud for sin brudgom. Og jeg hørte fra tronen en høy røst som sa, «Se, Guds bolig er hos menneskene. Han skal bo hos dem, og de skal være hans folk. Og Gud selv skal være hos dem. Han skal være deres Gud. Han skal tørke bort hver tåre fra deres øyne, og døden skal ikke være mer, heller ikke sorg eller skrik eller smerte. For det som en gang var borte. Han som sitter på tronen sa, «Se, jeg gjør alle ting nye.» Og så fortsetter det. Og han la til, «Skriv det ned, for dette er troverdige og sanne ord.» Så sa han til meg, «Det er skjedd, jeg er alfa og omega, begynnelsen og enden. Jeg vil gi den tørste og drikke av kilden med livets vann som gave. Den som seirer skal få dette i arv, og jeg vil være hans Gud, og han skal være min sønn. Men de feige, de vantro og vanhellige, de som myrder, driver med hor og trolldom, avgudsdyrkere og alle løgnere, deres plass skal være i sjøen som brenner med ild og svovel. Det er den annen død. Ja, dette står i Bibelen, i en vers som brukes til trøst, og man stopper før vers 8 som jeg leste her. Hva er det som skjer når man kontrasterer? Eller, altså, hva gjør vi med sånne tekster? Det er et spørsmål alle som jobber med hellige tekster må forholde seg til. Og disse voldsomme bildene, de er jo allegoriske, og samtidig så er de så konkrete. Han skal tørke bort hver tåre fra deres øyne. Det er et konkret bilde, ikke sant? Og sammen med altså de voldsomme bildene. Hva gjør det med oss? Og jeg tenker å si, knyttet til denne teksten her, 2 eksempler. Jeg studerte i USA noen år etter Hurricane Katrina. Og der hadde vi et fag som het Natural Disasters and God. Og hvor vi leste artikler skrevet av mainstream kristne ledere som gjorde koblinger mellom amerikaneres frafall fra troen, enten det handlet om abort, homofili, generell nedgang i kirkesøkning, hva enn det skulle være, kunne forklares, altså denne naturkatastrofen kunne forklares med denne kontrasteringen, ikke sant, mellom de rettroende og de som ikke det. Altså det noen grupper som får skylda for forferdelige ting som skjer. Det samme så vi etter masseskytingen på Orlando og nattklubb, som jo ble av noen tolket inn i en kontekst som nettopp handler om de vantro eller de som ikke følger Guds bud. Dette her var en enkelttekst. Nå skal jeg lese en annen tekst fra første Peters brev, og det en tekst som handler om forordning i samfunnet og i verden, under overskrift å leve i verden. Og da tenker jeg bare å si litt om 1 minutt, ikke sant? Hvordan man forholder seg til styresmakter.
Bedre at du sitter her.
Ja. Dere skal for Herrens skyld underordne dere enhver myndighet blant menneskene, enten det keiseren, den øverste, eller landshøvdingene som han har utsendt. De skal straffe dem som gjør det onde, og rose dem som gjør det gode. For det Guds vilje at dere ved å gjøre det gode skal stoppe munnen på uforstandige og tankeløse mennesker. Dere frie, bruk bare ikke friheten som påskudd til å gjøre det onde, men til å tjene Gud. Vis alle ære, elsk søskenfellesskapet, frykt Gud, og gi keiseren ære. Her jo blitt brukt som unnskyldning for å ikke gripe inn når styresmakter gjør overgrep mot minoriteter, og det så vi veldig tydelig i Tyskland, og tyske og østerrikske kirker som ikke grep inn, og ikke sa noe, ikke gjorde motstand i tiden før og under 2. verdenskrig. Har tida mi gått? Ja.
Senaid, vær så god.
Det min tur. Yes, kjempefint, takk. Jeg skal prøve å ta dere gjennom, jeg velger 3 verser som jeg tror nok for å forstå hvor galt kan dette gå. Tar først en som på en måte illustrerer hvor galt kan det være når vi ikke tar i betraktning det som professoren har sagt. 3 ting. Omstendighetene, kontekst og helheten. Det veldig viktig at vi har dette i hodet. Og dette, bare hør hvordan det starter. Så ved over dem som ber. Jeg ikke helt sikker hvordan dette høres på norsk. Det mye bedre og mer forferdelig på arabisk. Så det så ved over dem som ber. Hvis man stopper her, så man skal på en måte tenke, så hva de som ber, man på en måte forteller dem, hva gjør dere? Men denne verser fortsetter. Men uaktsomme om bønnene sine. De som gjør godt bare for å vise seg fram. Så man kan be, men man kan be på denne måten. Uaktsom når man ber, og når de ber bare for å vise seg. Og vegrer seg for å låne bort alminnelige ting til andre. Så nå flytter jeg til mine opprinnelige verser som virkelig har, eller ble brukt alle disse årene, spesielt etter 11. september. Og dette dere har hørt sikkert mange ganger. Og vi skal minne også, eller huske det som jeg leste før. Versen starter på denne måten. Drep dem hvor dere påtreffer dem. Så verset starter på denne måten. Drep dem hvor dere påtreffer dem. Og det som har skjedd så mange ganger, alt stopper her. Og de som gjør ugjerninger, de faktisk bruker dette som argument, og de rettferdiggjør deres ugjerninger. Enten ekstremisme, hva så over. Men saken er at hele greia stopper ikke her. Drep dem hvor dere påtreffer dem, og driv dem ut fra det sted som de har drevet dere ut fra. Og dette har med en konkret kontekst. Når profeten Mohammed måtte flytte fra Mekka til Medina. Han ble drevet ut fra Mekka til Medina. Og der i Medina, de som har drevet ham ut, så de starter med deres angrep på ham. Og disse versene faktisk har med akkurat dette å gjøre. Men dette ble brukt gjennom historien, og spesielt siste 20 år. Og siste ting, bare tredje, også som også illustrerer og forteller oss hvor galt kan det gå. Kjemp for Guds sak mot dem. Og man kan stoppe her. Og det kan gi deg grønt lys. Men det fortsetter og sier, kjemp for Guds sak mot dem som bekjemper dere. Hovedsakelig, det finnes ingen argument, eller ingen pådriv på en måte, som skal gi oss som muslimer grønt lys til å angripe. Hovedsakelig, alt som dere leser gjennom Koran, det har med beskyttelse å gjøre. To protect.
Senaid, skal vi stoppe der, og så tar vi det videre i diskusjonen. Tusen takk, Mikael.
Ja. Jeg har valgt en tekst, som jeg har valgt ikke at læse højt for at sikre salens nattesøvn. Det er 5. Mosebog, kapitel 13-19, hvor der er en tekst, som veldig korthed går ut på, at hvis man kommer til en by, hvor alle er afgudstyrkere, der står der, man skal rasere hele byen og fjerne alt, og det skal aldrig bygges op igen. Det er en meget voldsom historie. For nogle år siden, nu er det nogle 10 år siden, tror jeg, så brugte en tidligere norsk statsminister dette i et stort indlæg i en debat om Midtøsten, og forlangte, at dette skulle tages ud af det, som man i Norge kalder det gamle testamente. Ikke sant? Og for at bevise altså den her krigeriske religion, hvor voldsomt det er, og de var i det mindste fjerne de ting for at ligesom, altså det er det mindste, vi kan forlange. Det er naturligvis ikke nogen god tilgang. Dette er min hellige tekst. Altså det er Toraen, det som man i Norge kalder de 5 Mosebøger. Men det er ikke mit narrativ. Det er utroligt vigtigt at forstå, at dette er ikke et jødisk narrativ. Det jødiske narrativ, det som er den måde, som jøder har levet på i mange tusind år, det er at den kommentar, eller som man finder i Talmud, om at noget sådan har aldrig været og vil aldrig komme til at ske. Det er mit narrativ. Det er ikke
mit narrativ ikke at løbe rundt og dræbe andre mennesker. Så det vigtigt i forhold til det blev sagt i det sidste indlæg, altså den her tekstlige at rydde rundt og finde ting hos religioner, som kan vise, hvor forfærdeligt det er. Det kan vi gøre om absolut alle. Hvis vi skal starte en konkurrence om at fjerne alle vers, så tror jeg ikke, det bliver specielt mye igen af nogle hellige tekster, så det er en dårlig idé. Når det er sagt, og det knytter sig lidt op til det, der har været sagt af kloge ord og tidligere i dag, verdenshistorien og også jødisk historie viser, at når man bruger religiøse argumenter altså i militære eller i voldelige kontekster, så bliver religionen en slags krydder, altså krydder man kommer i for som bliver et vældig farligt instrument i hænderne på os alle, at man ligesom kan gøre det. Det bedste eksempel for jødisk historie er jo noget, som tager os tilbage nærmest til Bibels tid og ikke så længe efter Jesus, det sidste store oprør mod romerne, det hedder den, som jo endte først i en fantastisk begejstring over den her befrielse af judæer, og nu skulle alt blive godt, og den her totale oprørende blev knust fuldstændig af den romerske overmagt, ikke sandt? Og voldsomme dødstal og fuldstændig katastrofe. Og det, som førte til, at det blev til krig mod en overmagt, som ville være helt irrationelt at begynde at slås mod den romerske overmagt, det var religiøse argumenter for specielt den allerstørste jødiske leder på den tiden. Altså, hvis vi bare starter krigen, så går alt godt, for de Gud er med os. Og det kan man jo godt tro på, men resultatet bliver som regel dårligt. Så det var de 2 pointer, jeg gerne ville tage frem. Det ene er, at man skal prøve at skelne mellem, hvad er narrativet, hvad er den levende religionen, og hvad er teksten. Og det andet er, at vi skal alle være varsomme med, hvordan man bruger religion eller tekster i voldelige kontekster.
Tusen takk for kloke innlegg. Det jeg tenker på, det spørsmålet som med en gang kommer i mitt hode, hvordan vil dere inngå i en samtale med ungdom i deres menigheter som kanskje ikke har nødvendigvis sosialisert inn at dette våre hellige tekster, som kanskje har mer motstand, og som kanskje møter mye motstand fra andre ungdommer som ikke deles deres livssyn. Og så kommer det en tekst om et eller annet om at folk som ikke fysisk helt, som har skader på kroppen for eksempel, ikke kan nå Guds nåde. Det et helt konkret eksempel fra en bat mitzvah jeg var i, nemlig, hvor piken som skulle stå til bat mitzvah synes at et bestemt vers var veldig problematisk og nesten ville trekke seg fra hele, for dette kunne ikke hun stå innenfor. Og spørsmålet da liksom, hvordan møter man ungdom som kanskje har en helt annen referanseramme?
Du har jo selv svaret på spørsmålet. Selve det at hun får lov at sige akkurat, hvad hun mener, det er jo svaret på dit spørgsmål, at der er plads til unges meninger, der er plads til unges synspunkter, der er plads til unges skepsis. Det tror jeg på en måde er svaret, som ligger i dit spørgsmål. Det jo ikke sådan, hvis jeg ikke skal rive den tekst ud af boken, det på en måde, men heller hvor vigtige de spørgsmål hun tager op, hvor vigtigt det er.
Jeg tror det veldig enkelt faktisk, når vi møter ikke bare ungdom, men også fordomsfulle mennesker. Så man prøver å opplyse dem og fortelle dem og gi dem disse eksempler. Og man kan starte akkurat med den første eksempelet, hvor de som ber, Gud sier for en bortkastet tid at du ber. Hvis du stopper der, det forferdelig. Så hvorfor ber vi? På denne måten. Men det fortsetter. Så det vi gjør, også i disse tilfeller hvor det er helt skremmende, drep dem hvor dere finner dem. Så man prøver å få alle, spesielt våre unge mennesker, til å forstå at hvert vers har sin tid. Når det ble åpenbart, det snakk om en konkret kontekst. Og det som ble også nevnt, helheten også viktig. Men vi ofte ofrene for at tekst eller deler av tekster tas ut av kontekst. Og når man gir den type kunnskap til hvem som helst, ikke bare til våre unge, vi veldig opptatt av de som sprer fordommer, som sprer den type. Så derfor jeg må si også, når det var snakk om narrativer før oss, for meg virket det, jeg ønsket å spørre, virket det undervurdering av narrativer. Narrativer spiller kjempeviktig rolle. Dette vet jøder for andre verdenskrig, og dette vet vi nå som muslimer. Narrativer kan være alt. Kan være forspill. Alt skjer etter narrativer, eller på grunn av narrativer. Muslimer tar over Europa innen 2050. Dette sa FrP, dette sa mange av våre politikere her, dette sier høyre ekstreme og så videre. Det en farlig narrativ, og på grunn av dette så mange folk sliter i dag, inkludert spesielt de som med sin utseende sier hvem de som kvinner med hijab.
Annette?
Jeg tenker at en ungdom som har de spørsmålene må jo møtes med applaus, fordi at da gjør den ungdommen det den skal, nemlig gå i kamp med tekstene, med seg selv og med sin egen erfaring og med sin egen tanker om rett og galt. Og da tenker jeg at noe av det som i hvert fall i en kristen kontekst kan være utfordrende, at vi forveksler, vi tror at vi kaller jo Bibelen for Guds ord, og da tenker vi at da på en måte end of discussion. Mens Bibelen jo full av kontraster og full av motsetninger, og det jo på en måte vi inviteres inn i en dans, da, tenker jeg, hvor på en måte vi skal finne ut av vår vei med disse tekstene og skape mening. Og det jo, og da nettopp det at med en sånn erfaring da, starte med en vanskelig tekst jo en kjempegodt utgangspunkt. Og så tenker jeg at jeg ville løfte opp flere tekster som sier, kanskje som kan si, Jesus sier noe om at det regner på rettferdige og urettferdige i møte med et menneske som hadde en funksjonsnedsettelse, ikke sant? Så for å understreke at det ikke noe mennesket gjør for å ha fått en diagnose eller fått en lidelse, men samtidig så finnes liksom hele spektret i Bibelen, ikke sant? Og du kan si hva som helst, og du kan begrunne dem i Bibelen, dessverre, ikke sant? Og dermed så tenker jeg at å gi ungdom en forståelse for at det plass til hele mennesket, og at disse tekstene de finnes også fordi at vi skal gå i rette med dem. Vi skal ikke lese alt medhårs, vi skal lese mothårs, og vi skal gå i diskusjon med våre egne hellige tekster. Og på den måten så tenker vi også kanskje med å åpne rommet for at, liksom at samfunnet våre ikke blir lukket innovervendte, men åpne, og da kan vi også da det lettere da, for en som tilhører en religiøs retning å kunne bli møtt med disse tekstene som folk med rette da, ikke sant, kan komme og kritisere en religiøs tradisjon for.
Ja, og da har vi jo liksom snakket om den delen av den unge befolkningen som forholder seg da, til institusjonalisert religion, og som forholder seg til religiøse ledere. Og så blir det jo et stort spørsmål alle dem som ikke kommer til dere da. Ikke sant? Og på mange måter, hvis du tenker i et sånt stort perspektiv, så det jo spørsmålet om religiøs autoritet. Og det handler på en måte også om religion og demokratisering. Ikke sant? At religiøse ledere utfordres på andre måter nå enn de gjorde før. Og det handler jo også om demokrati generelt, da, ikke sant? At folk skal kunne lese selv og tolke. Så jeg lurer liksom på hvordan tenker dere at dere skal nå lenger ut da? Hvordan på en måte insistere på tradisjonens fortolkningsrammer i en sånn ganske fragmentert religiøs virkelighet?
Det, som jeg gør til daglig, det at jeg leder noget, som hedder informationstiltak mod antisemitisme. Det et veldig stygt navn, men det dækker jo over, at vi, en liten jødisk minoritet, vi deler os selv. Der er jødiske vejvisere på skoler, vi tager imod skoleklasser. Så det vi gør, det at vi deler et indenfra perspektiv. Eller altså mange indenfra perspektiver deler vi på netsiderne vores og sådan. Det vil sige, at vi åbner for, at andre kan se, hvordan ulike jøder tænker, ikke sant? Nu det jo interessant, at vi snakker hele tiden om fortolkning af tekster. Det jo ikke helt sådan, at jeg lever, og så det vil sige, her har vi også kanskje en kristen måde at tale på, som på en måde ikke jeg vokset op med i nogle fortolkning af tekster. Jeg vokset op med min tradition og den måde, vi lever på, og et mangfold af måder at leve for inden for den ramme. Jeg vet ikke om det svarte litt på spørsmålet.
Jo, det gjør jo det, og jeg tenker at det peker litt på det vi snakket om egentlig hele dagen, da. Altså dette tekstlige fokuset. Så hvordan vi skal åpne opp for det. Men spørsmålet var jo litt også om autoritet. Altså hvem det som kan gå inn og si at noen ikke har lov til å lese dette koranverset på akkurat denne måten?
Ja, man kan ikke forby noen som helst til å gjøre eller til å si hva som helst. Så spesielt når det åpent på sosiale medier, internett. Det et stort rom. Og jeg tror det helt ok at folk bruker det. Det synd at mange misbruker det med å selvsagt ta dette som arena hvor de formidler eller sprer deres fordomsfulle eller hatefulle eller insinuasjoner og så videre. Og dette kan være i vårt tilfelle fra muslimer, og dette kan være av ikke-muslimer. Men det som poenget her, problemet ligger ikke i dem. Problemet kan ligge i oss. Så vi må ut. Og vi må prøve å pålegge oss. Så lenge vi ikke gjør det, så de skyter. De sier hva de ønsker, og de sprer hva de ønsker. Så vi må ut av 4 veggene, våre moskéer, synagoger, kirker, og mot folk. Og på sosiale medier. Vise oss. Og tilby noe annet enn det som virker merkelig, hvis vi ønsker å leve sammen. Jeg tror det måten å bekjempe dette, og spesielt i vårt tilfelle, så dere har hørt flere ganger om cybermuftis. Cybermuftis, det har ingenting å gjøre med mainstream, men de muftis, de kaller seg muftis. Så lenge ingen dukker opp fra oss, så vi risikerer at de blir relevante. Og alt de sier blir relevant. Så det stort ansvar på oss. Ikke de som liker å være anarkiske, ønsker ikke å være i et system, institusjon. Men sånn det vi har valgt å leve så fritt. Og det har sin pris. Så det opp til oss veldig mye.
Vi skal straks åpne opp for spørsmål fra salen, men før det så det Annette.
Jeg vil også si litt om nettopp det, eller koble på det du sier om å være tilgjengelig og være til stede der, altså utenfor våre egne bygg på en måte. Og jeg tenker at altså på Haugerud, der hvor jeg jobber som prest, så jobber vi med å komme til skoleklasser sammen med en representant fra den lokale moskeen. Fordi vi ser at det åpner opp for samtale, og åpner opp for å tenke større om hvem den andre Og det på en måte, jeg kan gjøre det ut fra både et menneskelig engasjement, men også ut fra et religiøst engasjement. Og det vet jeg at min dialogpartner Ashal også gjør, at liksom, og det sier vi jo, ikke sant, i de møtene vi har, at dette en del av det å være kristen, eller en del av det å være muslim, å være møte hverandre med godhet, møte hverandre med respekt og nysgjerrighet. Og så kan vi tenke ulikt om hva som sant sånn, i en religiøs sfære. Og likevel så, eller sånn, jeg tror på en måte kraften av å opptre sammen veldig sterk da. Og kanskje særlig blant ungdom hvor mennesker, og i klasser hvor mennesker har veldig forskjellig tilhørighet og veldig forskjellig liksom, utviklet språk for nettopp den tilhørigheten. Og det å se at, liksom, at ledere opptrer sammen med respekt, det tror jeg kjempeviktig. Og så tror jeg også at som kirke eller, og som religiøse institusjoner så må vi også si fra klart og tydelig på de foraene vi når religionene blir misbrukt. Og så tenker jeg at for 15 år siden så var det lettere å på en måte få lederplass i en avis. Det det ikke så lett lenger nå, men det å være tilgjengelig på nett, og der vi kommer til orde da, for å synliggjøre og tydeliggjøre når religion blir misbrukt. For jeg tenker at det ikke all teologi som ikke god teologi. Det ikke likestilt selv om vi dialogiske på en måte. Det finnes måter å misbruke evangeliene på. Det finnes måter å skape splid i stedet for å skape fred. Og da tenker jeg det må vi kunne snakke tydelig om.
Takk for veldig gode innspill. Da det spørsmål fra salen. Ja.
Hei, middelaldrende mann med mer et innspill, mer en kommentar enn et spørsmål. Hei, jeg heter Didrik, jeg jobber i Human-Etisk Forbund. Og vi slapp jo å sitte i det panelet der, for vi har jo ikke hellige skrifter og med vers i. Og da kan man tenke på at da slapp Human-Etisk Forbund billig unna. Men det synes jeg ikke vi fortjener. Jeg synes vi skal ha det like vanskelig som alle andre. Så jeg snakker litt om at jeg jobber i min jobb en del med unge folk. Og vi har som nevnt ikke hellige skrifter. Vi har ikke den typen dogme, trossatser, men vi har en god del forestillinger som tradert i vår tradisjon, som står veldig, veldig sterkt, og som mange av oss tar veldig for gitt. Og de kan være ganske skumle. Det kan handle om at vi mer rasjonelle enn religiøse mennesker. Vi mer vitenskapelige, vi mer humane, vi mer etiske, og så videre, og så videre. Og det kan fort bli ganske skummelt, fordi veldig mye av dette her jo bare tull, selvfølgelig. Så det jeg jobber ganske mye med når jeg jobber med unge mennesker, nettopp å beinhardt utfordre dem på disse forestillingene. Og også hele tiden grave opp våre egne verste sider, og hele tiden utfordre det. Ideen for eksempel om at vi så mer humane enn andre jo helt skrekkelig når man tenker på humanistbevegelsens samrøre med eugenikken i gamle dager for eksempel, og sånn, ikke sant? Så det en sånn ting som veldig viktig for oss som ikke religiøse da, og hele tiden ta fatt på. I nyere tid har vi også sett hvordan den amerikanske ateistbevegelsen i veldig stor grad gled bare over i ren høyre ekstremisme via hat mot muslimer og jøder og så videre. Sånn at det liksom det skumle greier vi leker med, og selv om vi ikke har en religiøs forankring, så må vi være obs på det. Takk.
Hei, for det første, unnskyld at jeg kom for sent. Mitt navn Sharol Tatatar, og jeg kommer fra Nordisk Bibelmuseum, som et nytt museum i Oslo. Jeg sosialhistoriker, spesialisert på middelalderens migrasjoner, migrasjonsstudier og på hedensk teologi. Så det ikke mange som vet at det i det hele tatt finnes hedensk teologi, men det faktisk et forskningsfelt som det verdt å utdype. Og de to prosjektene jeg jobber på nå, i august så var jeg i Mongolia for å presentere min forskning om den politiske teologien bak nomadestatene fra og med Hunno, de som den store kinesiske mur ble bygget mot, og så frem til Genghis Khan. Og det andre prosjektet jeg jobber på kristningen av Ungarn rundt år 1000, som foregikk med krigføring mot hedenske ungarere. Og unnskyld, men jeg har prinsipielle betenkeligheter imot at det i det hele tatt kan finnes felles grunn mellom religioner. Det fordi veldig mange religioner har veldig mye til felles, Men det religion egentlig handler om, tro på en øvre makt som skaper en kosmisk orden. Og fra og med den kinesiske keiseren til nomadekaganer og kaner, og også europeiske keisere, hedensk-romerske keisere, Midtøstens antikke ledere, Israels konger, har alle representert én ting, og det at alle må godta den ene og sanne kosmiske orden, som uttrykt i mytologiske symboler. Mytologi symbolsk teologi, teologisk tale. Det uttrykt i ritualer, og det uttrykkes i statsdannelse. Så jeg veldig skeptisk til at dette prosjektet i det hele tatt mulig. Tusen takk.
Det noen som vil kommentere på det som har kommet nå? Det har jo ikke vært noe direkte spørsmål, men eller skal vi samle det litt opp? Ja, da gjør vi det.
Okay. Hei, jeg Gunnar Ketu fra Oslo Buddhistsenter. Jeg synes, Grisman, din kommentar til Anette var veldig interessant. At du kjente deg ikke igjen i den kanskje mer kristne perspektiv på dine tekster. Og som nå en buddhist vokser opp i vestlig kultur, så anerkjenner jeg at jeg synes det veldig vanskelig eller jeg skjønner at jeg ikke skjønner ditt perspektiv eller muslimsk perspektiv på å lese tekstene. Så jeg skulle veldig gjerne høre, som en ungdom da, eller meg, hvordan kan jeg forstå det at tekstene deres og deres ikke tolkes på den måten kanskje som Anette tolker Bibelen, eller som jeg tolker en tekst. Det tydelig som et spørsmål?
Nei. Jeg kan godt si.
Ja. En til, og så tar vi...
Hei, jeg heter Susanne Kromberg. Jeg har forskjellige hatter på. En at jeg har vært sykehusprest som kveker i USA. Og dessverre så jeg jo forhindret fra å være sykehusprest i Norge på grunn av min religion. Jeg jobber med selvmordsforebygging nå på Livslosen. Og vi tar imot mennesker til et 5 dagers opphold. Og der får de spise måltider, sove om natta, være våkne om dagen. Og så har vi samtaler og går tur. Og min interesse her, kan du si, det altså den volden som blir rettet mot en selv. Og da... Altså i USA så det en teolog som heter Walter Wink, som har skrevet om myten om the myth of redemptive violence, eller myten om den forløsende vold. Altså det en tanke om at bruk av vold forløser og gjenoppretter orden i et samfunn, eller i et menneske, muligens. Så jeg lurer på hva slags tankegods dere har spesielt da fra den jødiske tradisjonen og den muslimske tradisjonen, men også andre ideer fra kristendommen om ideen om å bruke vold for å gjenopprette orden, kanskje i ens eget liv ved et selvmord. Hva kan jeg bruke i de møtene? Hva slags ideer tar jeg med der?
Det noen som vil begynne?
Jeg vil kommentere deres Mongolia-greie. Jeg tror du helt fri til å se på det vi gjør på måten du ser det, så det helt fritt, men jeg veldig opptatt av dette arbeidet, av det vi ønsker å oppnå, eller vi ønsker å fortsette med. Så det eneste måten i mangfoldet vi lever nå, den plurality hvor du ikke har eneste land i verden som ikke på en måte mangfoldig, Så det måten å gå videre å finne måter hvordan vi kan leve sammen. Og det det vi jobber med. Og den andre
Fortolkning.
Nei, jeg husker ikke faktisk den siste. Du sa
altså hvordan selvmord? På selvmord?
Ja, men det var spørsmål faktisk.
Eller det med hellige tekster, hvordan man forholder seg til disse vanskelige, var fra Oslo Buddhistsenter.
Ja, men dere kan gå, så jeg kan komme tilbake.
Det spørsmål du hadde om fortolkning av hellige tekster og det jeg sagde her i vores samtale. Jeg tror det er viktig at vi forstår at vi bor i Norge, og det er en 1000 år kristen tradisjon, og så er det helt naturligt, og det skal være sånn at språket og referanserammene de er kristne, og det er ikke noe galt i det. Sånn det på en måte, sånn det i alle kulturer, det er et faktum. Jeg skal vise en fantastisk illustrasjon. Vi hadde besøk av en 6. klasse i synagogen, og de var fantastisk, de var velforberedt, det var en fantastisk team vi hadde sammen. Og til sidst så sidder den her jente og bare må spørre. Altså hun spør, hvor er kirkegården? Og det er jo et strålende spørsmål, det sagde jeg også med en gang. Det her er det mest glimrende spørsmål jeg har fått. Altså, for det første, hun kommer, og så er hun overrasket over bygget. Hun har glædet seg til å se synagogen, og hendes reference er jo noe annet, så det bør jo være noen gravpladser rundt, og det er der ikke. Så altså allerede der så er der grund til undren. Og det næste er jo, at det hedder en kirkegård, og hvor man begraver sine døde. Og det hedder det i Norge, og det hedder det også på dansk, men det er jo fordi, at dette er kulturen. Så derfor liksom alt den måde, som vi opererer, og når du snakker om tolkning, eller fortolkning av tekster, så er vi i den kulturelle ramme, som vi er i Norge. Og det er ikke min ramme, men jeg forstår jo godt, at den er der, og derfor forstår jeg til dels, hvad folk spør om, men det er jo ikke noe jeg kjenner meg igjen i. Det er jo ikke sånn at jeg lever, og plutselig så er der en eller annen, der har en annen fortolkning, og så starter jeg å spise cheeseburger. Det er ikke sånn det fungerer. Okay.
Annette?
Jeg vil egentlig bevege meg mot det spørsmålet fra du som har vært sykehusprest. Jeg har også vært sykehusprest i USA, og jobbet med eksistensielle temaer som kommer i møte med sykdom. Det er en utrolig krevende øvelse. Et menneske som opplever dyp eksistensiell krise, og som utøver vold mot seg selv. Hva slags ord finnes der, og hva slags, altså finnes det en god tekst å gi, som kan kanskje snu et menneskes selvoppfatning. Jeg har aldri jobbet sånn at jeg på en måte, altså jeg har aldri jobbet sånn med Bibelen eller med bibeltekster at man måtte gå så konkrete verks, men jeg har ofte snakket om at vi ser oss med speil og i gåter. Det snakker Paulus om, og sånn er det å være menneske. Vi ser i glimt, vi ser i speil, vi ser i gåter, vi ser ikke den hele og fulle sannheten eller virkeligheten, fordi vi er bare mennesker. Og det å kanskje åpne rommet til at livet er noe vi får lov til å utforske, og som ikke handler om nødvendigvis rett og galt innenfor, utenfor. Men det er altså, og i apostelens gjerning hvor det så, det er i Gud vi lever, beveger oss og er til. Altså sånn, den type romslighet har jeg prøvd å finne frem til når jeg har jobbet i sjelesorg med mennesker som jeg har sjelden jobbet med mennesker som har selvmordsforsøk bak seg, men ofte mennesker som snart skal møte sin egen død, og som fortolker den som en straff. Hva gjør vi med det? Og da tenker jeg det finnes, da er kanskje Bibelens poesi et godt sted å begynne. Og tenke at vi er her som likeverdige partnere med en tekst vi skal prøve å skimte glimt av noe hellig bak, da. Ja.
Vi nærmer oss avslutning, det vel 5 minutter igjen, men 2 korte kommentarer fra Mikael og Senaid, og så det 2 spørsmål. Og da vil jeg bare be om at de 2 siste spørsmålene ikke veldig lange kommentarer, men litt sånn konkrete spørsmål, eller, ja.
Omkring det spørsmål rundt selvmord. Jeg tror, det utrolig viktig at slå fast, at religioner ikke noen slags svarbank på alle livets store spørsmål, og i nogle af de tilfælde, du snakker om, så vil jeg kanskje anbefale, at man henter anden ekspertise ind for at hjælpe. Jeg tror ikke på en måde, at jeg har en eller anden hemmelig tekst, som kan hjælpe en person, der har det sådan, som du beskriver.
Selvmordstanker noe av det vanskeligste vi jobber med også. Og vi selv som ledere, som spirituelle ledere, vi prøver å finne måten hvordan vi kan kommunisere med vår ungdom, fordi det reelt problem. Og jeg husker med en gang noe som ble sagt lenge siden av en svensk historiker, tror jeg, som sa, og det så relevant den dagen i dag, som sa på engelsk, we have given our people everything to live by, but we have never given our people something to live for. Så vi som religiøse, vi prøver å finne ut hva faktisk det for. Og vi liker å tro at måten å gå videre å bli fysisk og spirituelt i god form. Og prøve å understreke hvor spirituelle verdier viktige for oss. Hvor det ikke bare viktig hva vi har på oss, men hva vi har også inne oss. Og det måten hvordan vi gjør det. Og det også med hva religioner har for å, eller må man bruke tvang eller vold for å oppnå. I islam det veldig mye veldig mye godt og veldig gode råd når det kommer til å kommunisere med andre for å åpne mål sammen med andre, med å invitere andre til samtale, til dialog. Hvis andre ønsker fred, du må gå for fred på denne måten. Og når du inviterer med klokskap, med gode råd. Så det veldig mye der. Det bare å plukke, men dessverre så man finner alltid individer og individuelle grupper som plukker noe annet, og spesielt tar tingene ut av kontekst.
Da det 2 kjappe spørsmål avslutningsvis.
Ja. Berit Hagen-Ager fra Norske kirke. Jeg tror Mikael sa noe utrolig viktig i din åpningskommentar, at vi må skille mellom tekst og narrativ. Og da slo det meg plutselig at vi kanskje i vår lutherske tradisjon har mistet noe, fordi vi så veldig opptatt av teksttolkningen. Så jeg synes det var en veldig god påminning om at alle tekster også har en historie og en fortolkning. Og det fristende å spørre nett om det, men det har vi kanskje ikke tid til. Men, ja.
Lise Tostrup-Sætek, pensjonistprest i Norske kirke. Og jeg har et spørsmål jeg gjerne vil skal kommentere på, som jeg har med meg fra forrige sesjon. Og det det at en del kirker, sånn som de ortodokse kirkesamfunnene, de jo territoriale, altså de skapt og knyttet ut fra et territorium, og har spredd seg, og de har forskjellige ledere på de forskjellige territoriene, for de ikke enige. Og den lutherske kirken, og Luther gjorde opprør, og så ble han fredløs, og så kom det politiske opprøret fra bøndene, så ble han kjemperedd. For plutselig så visste han ikke om Fredrik den vise kom til å beskytte ham eller ei. Og dermed så måtte han jo passe på at man fikk et territorium for de kirkene. Og derfor ble de lutherske og reformerte kirkene også territoriale. Og alle de i Europa som ikke likte dette her, de dro til Amerika, og der fikk de også territorium, men det var da ikke basert på kirkesamfunn, men på andre ting. Og spørsmålet kan dere kommentere dette at våre impulser som vi har i gamle hjernen, på fight, flight and freeze, disse tre raske impulsene som går fortere enn tankene våre. Kan du kommentere på det i forhold til at man i en kristen tradisjon også kan ha noe sånn meditativt innadvendt bønn som gjør at man blir fortrolig med sitt underbevisste del og kan møte den på en fredelig måte?
Skal vi ta en veldig kort avslutning på hver av dere? Hvis vi begynner med Annette, og Senaid og Mikael.
Ja, jeg usikker på om jeg kan kommentere det siste, for jeg vet ikke helt om jeg forstod akkurat hva som er spørsmålet, men jeg skrev den setningen «Vi må skille mellom tekst og narrativ». Det en... Så takk for den setningen, og jeg bare vil kommentere fra deg at altså, kirkens narrativ, eller kirkens tekst har jo også vært gå og døp, og altså omvend folk, og det har jo blitt brukt som, altså tvangskristning har jo kjent, ikke sant, og det foregår ennå, og overgrep mot urfolk, og altså den type ting finnes i vår tradisjon. Og så ser jeg i hvert fall i mitt eget kirkesamfunn at narrativet vårt jo i større grad tilbake til det jeg vil tenke på en måte kristendommens kjerne, som William Cavanaugh egentlig oppsummerte så fint i sted, ikke sant? At altså, en vei som heller velger død enn å drepe, en vei som heller velger tap i tillit til at noe godt kan vokse ut, ikke sant? Og for den som tror på den oppstandende Jesus, vil jo på en måte tenke at det narrativet kirken skal formidle.
Jeg ønsker å tro at religioner forårsaker, ikke kriger. Men at vi som religiøse, spesielt som representerer religioner, at vi blir instrumentalisert. Dette skjer, dessverre. Og der har vi selvsagt jobb å gjøre. Og dette har vi sett i Bosnia, hvor jeg kommer fra, og i andre deler av verden. Så vi har jobb å gjøre når det virkelig kommer til dette, at vi finner oss i en situasjon hvor folk, hvor de som er over oss, spesielt politikere, vil gjerne manipulere med oss, og vil gjerne bruke oss for deres mål. Og der må vi vise mot. Må vi også ofte offre mye, men i den siste tilfellet ser jeg ikke at spesielt den ortodokse kirken i Russland er klar til å offre seg, eller offre noe for å motsette alle disse ugjerninger som foregår.
Jeg vil takke Sinead for svaret du gav på det om samarbejde eller samtale eller dialog mellem de ulike trosretninger og trossamfund. Jeg mener jo heller ikke, at vi skal være så like som muligt. Tværtimod, så skal vi blive kjent med hverandres forskjelligheter. Men møtet og blive kjent med hverandre og samtalen så utrolig vigtig. Jeg kan bare i forhold til deg, Sinead, sige, at vi har nogle gange med muslimske elever i norske skoleklasser, som kommer til synagogen og siger, lidt overrasket, at det ligner lidt på en moské. Ikke sant? Fordi at de ikke ser nogle billeder, altså bildeforbyttet. Og så har de taget også på, at de har fundet nogle dyr på, nogle udsmykninger og sådan ting. Og så sidder jeg og siger, ikke sant? Så det vil sige, så det er veldig fint, ligesom, at man bliver kjent med hverandre. Der er forskelle, men jo mere vi kjenner hverandre, jo bedre. Så jeg håper, vi skal fortsette med å bli kjent med hverandre.
Da vil jeg bare takke panelistene for veldig gode innspill og for gode spørsmål og kommentarer fra salen. Og så vil jeg kanskje være så dristig at jeg kommer med et lite innspill til neste års konferanse, fordi jeg synes det har kommet noen interessante ting frem her i dag. Og det er jo at vi ønsker å komme litt vekk fra denne tekstlige reduksjonismen, at vi ønsker å åpne opp for flere narrativer, og at vi kanskje åpner opp for en samtale om disse konkrete sosiale og performative aspektene ved religion, og hvordan det spiller inn både hva gjelder den autoritære vendingen, men også i spørsmålet om vold. Så tusen takk til dere.
Da vil jeg også få lov å benytte anledningen til igjen å få takke Iselin Frydenlund for å ha ledet oss gjennom vanskelige vers på en veldig god måte. Til slutt i dag så har jeg fått gleden og æren av å dele ut en pris. Som mange av dere sikkert vet, så deler STL ut en pris som vi kaller dialogprisen, hvert annet år. Den går til en person eller organisasjon, institusjon, som det står i mandatet, som over tid har utmerket seg ved å arbeide for økt forståelse og respekt mellom ulike tros- og livssynssamfunn i Norge. Og som gjennom dette arbeidet har bidratt til å bryte ned fordommer og øke dialog, kontakt og samhandling mellom disse. Årets vinner oppfyller alle disse kriteriene, og dialogprisen for 2022 tildeles Ivar Flåten. Styret har behandlet dette på flere styremøter, og har jeg også lyst til å lese begrunnelsen fra styret. Ivar Flåten er en av nestorene i norsk tros- og livssynsdialog. Han har satt dype spor gjennom sitt arbeidsliv og var primus motor i å etablere DOTL, altså Drammen og Omegn tro- og livssynssamfunn, i 2008 og Kirkelig dialogsenter Drammen. Som en del av sitt arbeid som prest i den norske kirke var Ivar tidlig opptatt av tros- og livssynsdialog med naboer i Drammen og bydelen Fjell. Flåten tør å holde dialogen fram som et viktig og riktig verktøy, også når det stormer i media og har kostet kritikk. Flåten har bidratt til det livssynsåpne samfunn ved å ha løftet bevisstheten om tros- og livssynsmangfold, dialog og STL. Vær så god, Ivar, hvis du vil komme fram, så skal du få en overrekkelse her. Et diplom og et bilde som viser samhold i mangfold mellom tro- og livssynsorganisasjonene. Jeg har fått dele ut en gang til tidligere, og det var på Slottet til prinsessens 18-årsdag, så du er den andre jeg får dele ut til i hvert fall, så du er i celebert selskap der, og blomster. Gratulerer med prisen. Tusen takk.
Tusen hjertelig takk for en svært ærefull og stor og betydningsfull pris, synes jeg. Det må også ses i kontekst, som vi har lært i dag. Jeg ble ordinert til prest, nesten 50 år gammel, samtidig som karikaturstriden var på sitt heteste. Så jeg har på en måte kommet inn i den norske kirke på et tidspunkt hvor det var mange ting som stod på spill, også i nabolaget vårt. Men fordi jeg har kloke ledere, både prost og biskop, som lot meg få tid og mulighet, så var vi en gruppe som møttes og som begynte å jobbe for å minimere og kanskje stå imot internasjonalt generert. Og altså vi sier når det smeller i Ankara eller Istanbul eller et eller annet sted, så rystes det også i Drammen. Og da må vi møtes. Og ikke dilemma, men paradokset kanskje. Det også at når kriser oppstår, når vi blir trengt fra mange kanter, som det er vel et sitat, så må vi søke sammen for å finne ut av ting. Og det har vært mitt privilegium, med god hjelp av STL. Anders Kartsov, som var koordinator på det tidspunktet, var jo en av de som også satte i gang prosessen i Drammen, som etter hvert førte til DOTL. Og så har det blitt mye annet senere. Men jeg oppfatter det som en stor ære, og som en stor glede, at jeg har fått denne prisen, og har kommet inn i et svært celebert lite selskap og prismottaker fra STL. Så igjen, hjertelig tusen takk.
Tusen takk. Da gjenstår det bare for meg å få lov å avslutte årskonferansen 2022 og ønske alle sammen vel hjem. Takk for i dag.